In that dream, Elena saw her kingdom 20 years from now, reduced to nothing but ruins and ash. Mankind slaughtered without mercy by hordes of monsters. The entire world drowning in catastrophe, and she herself hadn't escaped that fate either. It was only a nightmare. But Elena was certain it was the future she'd truly glimpsed. She sought out the old woman she'd once met on the street and told her everything she'd seen in the dream. The old woman told her the truth in return. "I chose you because I want you to change the tragedy that will happen 20 years from now. And the only way to prevent that catastrophe is for the Monster Duke's child to become the warrior who saves the world. But there's one condition. That child must be born of its parents' true love, or the future cannot be changed at all." That was the prophecy Elena carried into her wedding night, a few hours earlier, in the bedroom where she was fast losing her patience. Her husband had barely lain down, when she was already plotting to have her way with him. Thinking about what was about to happen brought a flush to Elena's cheeks. It was only because he refused to so much as touch her that she'd been driven to such measures. Following the steps laid out in a certain adult manual, Step 1, throw back the blanket. Step 2, climb onto him quickly before he's fully awake. Excellent, almost there. She still remembered how last time she'd been wrapped up like a cocoon before she even got her hands on him. Just as she leaned down to kiss him, her husband jolted awake, and the sight before him shattered Caden's worldview all over again. He truly could not understand why his wife craved his body so much. On their very first wedding night, he'd made it clear that though they were husband and wife, he would not lay a finger on her. To stop his wife from trying anything else, Caden grabbed the bedsheet and, amid the sound of tearing fabric, wrapped his wife up like a cocoon. Once done, he patted her shoulder to soothe her to sleep, as if she were a baby. Faced with his indifference, Elena seethed with frustration, as if she'd ever want to sleep so obediently with him again. Next time, she'd hide every last sheet in the room, as though he'd read his wife's intentions. Caden said gently, "Don't waste your energy next time. Even without sheets, I still have curtains." Elena was struck speechless. But even so, she still refused to give up. Unwilling as she was to just lie there behaving, the man's arms gave her an odd, unfamiliar sense of safety. Gazing at his sturdy build, she nearly drooled. "I heard sleeping in clothes is bad for circulation for your health's sake. Why don't you take them off?" Having said that, Elena even asked her husband to untie her, promising she wouldn't try anything. But no matter how much she swore it, her husband remained convinced she had no good intentions. With that, he wished her good night and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Elena woke up feeling utterly defeated. As the youngest daughter of a count's household, she was, after all, a beautiful young lady. In terms of wealth, her family was among the richest around. In terms of being doted on, her two elder brothers were always vying to spoil her. With conditions like that, what man wouldn't fall for her? And yet this husband of hers paid her no mind at all. Truth be told, Elena hadn't strictly needed to marry this man. It was only that, a few days earlier, she'd met an old woman on the street. Moved by pity, she'd bought her some food. And it was precisely because of that small kindness that she'd had a strange dream that very night. With that, the old woman vanished before the girl's eyes. And to keep the tragedy from happening, Elena had actively sought out the Monster Duke's fiancé and offered to marry into the ducal house in her place. The reason she did this was that she understood the other woman never wanted to marry there in the first place. For according to rumor, the Monster Duke, Caden, had been born with dark marks covering his face and had brought death to his entire family one by one. Everyone said he was cursed by a demon, so no girl was willing to marry him. But Elena thought differently. How could someone cursed by a demon possibly father a child destined to become a hero? Sure enough, faced with such a brazen move to steal her fiancé, the fiancé wasn't angry in the least, and instead excitedly broke the news to her family. When Elena's father heard of it, he couldn't help but be stunned. His daughter, who only yesterday had been declaring she'd stay single forever, was suddenly announcing she wanted to marry, and to the notorious Monster Duke, no less. Although this marriage would bring great benefit to the family, her father cared only for his daughter's happiness. To set her father's mind at ease, Elena gave an award-worthy performance, and thanks to her efforts, the engagement was finally settled. On the day of the wedding, Elena was a bundle of nerves. The moment the door to the future swung open, she finally laid eyes on the Monster Duke of rumor. The man's eyes, a clear, deep blue, left Elena utterly spellbound. She simply stared, as if drawn in by some kind of magic, until her cousin gave her a soft nudge. She didn't come back to her senses. As the two of them walked hand in hand up to the altar, Elena still couldn't stop herself from stealing glances at her husband. Afraid he'd overheard what she'd just said, she grew flustered with worry. But no sooner had her reason returned than the man swept her away again. This warm hand, this height that made her feel so safe, and these muscles straining against his sleeves. Elena kept reminding herself that all of this was for saving the world. She was no shallow admirer of looks. While her heart raced out of control, the two of them completed their vows. Once the ceremony ended, her family came one by one to bid Elena farewell. Even her husband's former fiancé cried and said she couldn't bear to see her go. But no matter how reluctant they were, they still had to part ways. The moment she climbed into the carriage bound for the Duke's territory, Elena couldn't help but steal glances at her husband. Her eyes never once left him, perhaps sensing his wife's burning gaze. Caden slowly spoke up. "You don't need to worry. I won't take off my mask in the carriage. But that's not the reason I'm looking at you." The man hadn't expected his wife to be so blunt, and for a moment, he had no idea how to respond. After a long journey, they finally arrived at the Duke's castle. The first thing Elena did was bathe and freshen up, then prepare to welcome the wedding night moment she'd been longing for. But when that moment actually arrived, she found herself pacing back and forth anxiously. Will it hurt? It probably will. I heard the first time always hurts. Just then, a bottle of strong liquor on the table caught Elena's eye. They say liquor gives you courage, so without a second thought, she downed the whole bottle. Then she plopped down on the bed, steeling herself as if heading into battle. It's nothing really, just get through the first time and it's over. And yet that wedding night, she was left waiting the whole night through, without so much as a hair of her husband in sight. Realizing she'd been left out in the cold, Elena was about to march off and demand an explanation, when she heard from a maid that the territory had been suddenly attacked by monsters the night before, and the Duke, for the safety of his people, had led his men to put down the chaos all night, only returning that morning. Elena let out a sigh of relief. So it wasn't that her husband had deliberately given her the cold shoulder. As the Duke's wife, she too had a responsibility to bear, to help her husband manage the affairs of the estate. From what Elena had learned, this land, though fertile and thriving in trade, was often plagued by monsters coming down from the mountains to terrorize the people. So few wanted to live here. But ever since her husband had taken over the territory, he had personally led the knights up the mountain and wiped out the monsters. Only then did the land finally reclaim the peace it had long lost, and he had been merely 16 years old at the time. That should have been an achievement praised by all, and yet because of it, people called him more terrifying than the monsters themselves. Thinking of this, Elena wanted nothing more than to stand up for her husband. But for now, the most important thing was to help him manage the castle. After 7 days and nights of relentless effort, she finally had a full grasp of everything in the territory. But it had also left her utterly exhausted, managing the castle's affairs by day, staying up late waiting for her husband by night. Elena lay in bed, forcing her eyes wide open. She swore that tonight, no matter what, she would not fall asleep halfway through. But ideals are one thing, reality another. In the end, she was left holding an empty bed once again. What on earth was going wrong here? Aside from the wedding day, she hadn't laid eyes on her husband even once since. At first, Elena assumed he was simply too busy. But after a whole week passed without so much as a glimpse of him, it was really too much. She couldn't stand it any longer, and decided to track him down for a clear answer. Just then, Elena noticed 2 maids in the corner of the room staring at her. Their timid expressions left her utterly confused. But what she wanted to know more than anything was why the Duke had been nowhere to be seen lately. And the maid's answer left Elena stunned. "That's right, it's all thanks to us. We told the Duke that you weren't feeling well. And from now on, we'll make sure to convince him not to come looking for you anymore." Elena couldn't bear to hear another word. So the wedding night she'd longed for so dearly had been blocked, all because of these 2 self-styled clever maids. Was it simply because her husband was the monster Duke? That they assumed no woman could possibly love him? For some reason, seeing her husband treated this way by his own servants hurt her even more than being humiliated herself. Elena summoned the head housekeeper and the head maid, and in front of everyone dealt with the 2 maids severely as a warning to others. Having dealt with those 2 troublemakers, Elena kicked open the door to her husband's study, seeing him without his mask for the first time. She found herself utterly transfixed. What demon mark was this? This was clearly an expensive tattoo, nothing more. The moment she got close to him, she couldn't resist reaching out to touch it. Faced with his wife's sudden gesture, Caden went from startled at first to gradually enjoying it. No one had ever caressed him like that before. The sensation was unfamiliar, yet he found himself drawn to it. Seeing this, Elena grew even bolder. This guy's skin is unbelievably soft, even smoother than mine to the touch. She had no idea how long she'd been stroking his face. Before Elena finally snapped back to her senses, now isn't the time for this. She planted her hands on her hips, striking the pose of a powerful lady boss, and declared to her husband, "I have no interest in sleeping apart from my own husband. So tonight, you are absolutely coming to my room?" With that said, Elena bolted off in a flash. Back in her room, recalling her husband's smooth skin, her throat suddenly felt parched. After downing a large cup of cool tea, she rushed off to take a flower bath. All of this was to give her husband the most perfect experience possible. That night, Elena sat on the bed waiting nervously. When a beam of light fell across her face, the husband she'd been longing for day and night had finally arrived. From the moment he stepped through the door, her gaze never once left him. Elena kept telling herself over and over that she was doing this to save the world, absolutely not because she craved his body. But the more she told herself that, the harder her heart pounded. Seeing this, her husband couldn't help but want to confirm it. "Do you really want to sleep with me?" "Of course, aren't we husband and wife? Who else would I sleep with?" His wife's firm answer left Caden frozen on the spot. But he quickly composed himself again, turning to switch off the light. At her husband's action, Elena felt both puzzled and full of anticipation. Could it be he preferred the dark? But then, why hadn't he taken off his clothes before turning off the light? Or did he want her to undress him herself? Elena's mind was still swimming with questions. When she saw her husband had already lain down, she followed suit and lay down too, without any experience of her own. But according to the novels, once a girl lay down, things were bound to happen. Elena closed her eyes and waited quietly, waiting and waiting, only to open her eyes and find her husband sound asleep, dead to the world. She could hardly believe it. Their first night sharing a bed, and her husband had simply fallen asleep like that. Though somewhat put out, looking at the man beside her, she felt an odd sense of peace. And so, before long, she too drifted off to sleep. When the morning sun poured into the room, the warmth her husband had left behind hadn't yet faded. Elena ran her hand over the spot. This was the first time since arriving at the territory that she'd slept so soundly, but she truly couldn't understand why her husband remained so indifferent toward her. Could it be he worried that, with her so new to this place, she wasn't mentally ready yet, and so he wanted to give her more time to adjust? But by now, Elena no longer needed any more time. So tonight, she was absolutely determined to knock her husband flat. But her drowsiness had gotten the better of her. With a thud, her forehead slammed straight down onto the desk. Elena nearly fainted from the pain right then and there. It genuinely hurt. If it didn't swell into a lump, she'd be lucky. Touching the red, swollen spot on her forehead, she wondered what on earth she'd just done to herself. It was all that dimwit's fault. They were married, weren't they, so he ought to fulfill his marital duties. Suddenly, an idea struck her. Recalling a lesson from that little book, she marched straight into her husband's study. With a huge bump still on her forehead, she demanded fiercely, "Do you have time?" The man said nothing, just stared fixedly at the swelling on her forehead. Elena was baffled. What was this guy even thinking? She asked again, and only then did he snap back to attention. "I have time, as long as it's not about our marital duties." Elena thought she might actually die of anger. "Didn't you promise to grant any request of mine?" "First request, you're not to get angry that I've come to find you out of the blue. Second request, you're not to throw me out. Third request, I want to be alone with you in here." Caden sighed helplessly. But seeing his wife's downcast expression, along with the lump on her forehead, he still waved for every last servant to leave. Elena wore a satisfied smile. The moment the door shut, she didn't hesitate for a second before hopping right up onto her husband's desk. This was a new trick she'd just picked up. The allure of the office, Elena let her fair, bare feet swing gently, confident that she must look positively irresistible right now. In the past, every time she'd pulled a move like this, even her brother, who loved to tease her, would give in, nodding along to whatever unreasonable request she made. "And you thought this wouldn't work on you?" The wild beast in Elena's heart roared with confidence. But what she never expected was that her breathtaking beauty, in her husband's eyes, had shrunk down to nothing but a giant bump. Elena, blissfully unaware she'd become a laughingstock, kept right on preening. Seeing her husband's dumbstruck expression, she assumed he'd been utterly enchanted by her. And riding the momentum, she pressed for one more request. "Compliment me, go on, compliment how I look." Hearing this, the man took 3 steps back and looked her over from head to toe, but stayed silent for a long while. Elena panicked. What was this guy getting at? Did he think she was a fool? The two of them stood in silence for a long moment before Caden finally spoke, slow and measured. You're beautiful, especially your jet black hair. The girl's face flushed red. Her supporting hand slipped, and just as she was about to fall, her husband caught her in time, then set her down on the desk. Looking at his handsome face now so close to hers, Elena's heart pounded wildly, her cheeks burning as if about to steam. You look so handsome today. She secretly fantasized about what might happen next. But her husband merely set her on the desk, then went on unhurried. You're beautiful, especially your hair, silver as moonlight. The color of your eyes is striking too, and also, your fingers. He trailed off before finishing the sentence. He was remembering the time before, when his wife had gently caressed him. The feeling had, to his own surprise, been rather pleasant. Elena lifted her hand and stared at it, puzzled. This guy really had no idea how to compliment anyone. The two fell silent once more. The girl suddenly realized her foolish husband was, in fact, quite handsome, especially those deep, endless blue eyes. You really are handsome. The words slipped out before she could stop them, followed immediately by her own flushed cheeks. Elena had always been confident, yet for some reason, only around this one man. Did she turn into someone else entirely? A single word from him could ruin her whole day. A single compliment could send her spirits soaring. This shift left her mind in a tangle. Could it be that she'd truly fallen for him? You don't have to come sleep in my room anymore, she blurted, then bolted from the room. Back in her room, Elena was still lost in thought. She must have gotten a little too worked up back there. A maid knocked and entered, carrying an ointment the Duke had sent for her. The girl didn't understand. Why would her husband send her ointment? Not until a blood-curdling shriek echoed through the room did Elena realize the enormous lump still sitting on her forehead, recalling what she'd thought were her most seductive moves earlier, and then her husband's expression as he looked at her. She wished the ground would just swallow her whole. For the next several days, Elena didn't dare set foot outside her door. Every day, aside from meals, she just lay on her bed applying ointment. A week passed, and she still burned with embarrassment over that day. Why hadn't anyone told her there was a lump on her forehead? Another week passed after that, and the lump on Elena's forehead finally went down. Taking advantage of the cover of night, she slipped quietly out of her room. After holding out for so long, she could finally sleep beside her husband again. Tonight, she was determined to knock him flat. But there was one thing she'd overlooked, and that was just how wary her husband had become of her. Because of the forehead lump incident, she'd deliberately kept her distance from him for 2 whole weeks, pretending she'd lost all interest in the matter of children, all just to make him let his guard down. So tonight, she was resolved to see it through. As the door clicked softly shut, Elena crept quietly to Caden's side. Looking at her husband's sleeping face, she nearly drooled. She lifted the blanket and climbed gently onto him. The result, once again, was him wrapping her up like a cocoon just like before, the exact same as last time. Faced with a husband like this, Elena genuinely felt she might lose her mind. Maybe she should just say it outright. Just tell him plainly that their child was destined to become a hero who'd save the world. Just as she was about to speak up, a wasp suddenly appeared and shot straight toward her. Elena spun around in fright and bolted, but tripped over a stone and went sprawling. Right at that moment, a hand caught her from behind around the waist. Are you all right? This man had a rather handsome face, especially his smile. But for some reason, the hand steadying her sent a chill crawling up her spine. After thanking him, the girl hurried off. Back in her room, Elena still couldn't stop thinking about the man from earlier. Asking around among the maids, she learned he was none other than the Duke's second son, ordinarily gentle and warm toward everyone, the kind of catch every young lady dreamed of. And yet, to this day, he remained single. This only left Elena more confused. So where had that chill she'd felt actually come from? She had a maid touch her arm as a test, but felt nothing like what she'd felt before. Could it be because of the difference in gender? Without meaning to, her thoughts drifted back to that dimwit of hers. She ended up sheepishly stepping into her husband's study, feeling utterly mortified. She was clearly still angry with him, and yet here she was, having to seek him out anyway. Could you lend me your hand for a moment? Her husband looked rather puzzled, but held out his hand all the same. Elena slowly placed her left hand into his palm, then carefully rubbed it top to bottom. The man startled, but didn't find it unpleasant in the least. On the contrary, her soft, pale hand felt rather nice. Elena noticed the calluses on her husband's hand, and her thoughts began to wander again. He must look so striking when he practices swordsmanship, especially with those firm muscles. Just thinking about it, she nearly drooled again. Is there something wrong with my hand? Hearing that, she snapped out of her daydream and quickly babbled something to cover herself. Look at this. Your hands are so big and thick. Much bigger than mine, they feel really nice to touch. Her husband panicked at that and hastily pulled his hand back. Elena quickly held out her own hand in turn. Go on, touch it. The odd request left the man at a loss. But seeing the expectant look in her eyes, Caden reached out and gently stroked it anyway. Elena both savored the feeling and gave directions. A little further down. A bit more pressure. No matter how much she fussed with it, she still couldn't find that same feeling from when the other man had touched her. Just as she was about to try again, Caden suddenly dodged away. Seeing his embarrassed expression only irritated her further. What's there to be shy about? She muttered a quick thanks and turned to leave. Only once the door had shut, did the man slowly lift his head. He truly could not understand it. Why this woman always seemed to want to sleep with him. He'd lost count of how many times he'd woken in the middle of the night to find her perched on top of him, wearing some strange, indescribable expression. Caden genuinely had no idea what to do with her anymore. As for Elena, she'd always been quite confident in herself, especially lately, ever since the blonde-haired herbalist had shown up. Not only had he once saved her, but he'd also made his fondness for her rather obvious. Just as she thought she was still as beautiful as ever, but she always felt there was something unsettling about that man. And it wasn't just her. The maids in the household felt the same way. Just being near him made anyone break out in a cold sweat they couldn't control. Perhaps that was a woman's sixth sense warning her to stay far away. Hearing this, Elena paused. After all, she was the Duke's wife. If that blonde herbalist was secretly tampering with the medicinal herbs, the ducal house would surely suffer major losses. So she decided to investigate the man herself, to prevent harm to the household and protect her husband's reputation. That way, her husband would surely be grateful to her, and would finally agree to have a child with her. Brimming with confidence, Elena got to work. But after 2 days of investigating, both openly and in secret, she found the blonde herbalist wasn't just friendly. He spoke with real courtesy, too, and was remarkably patient besides. No matter how she looked at it, he didn't seem like a criminal at all. This left Elena quite troubled. Could it really all just be a misunderstanding? Once we're done eating, would you like to take a walk together? The girl agreed right away. Truth be told, she'd always had one question. The blonde herbalist always delivered the herbs in person. Wasn't it a hassle, coming such a long way? Hearing the question, the man paused for a moment. Because herbs are something everyone needs. Regardless of age or gender, they can ease pain, even save lives. So delivering herbs makes him feel like he's fulfilling a calling. Does that sound silly? Hearing the herbalist's words, she wanted to slap herself twice. How could someone this kind possibly be a criminal? So her sixth sense had just been an illusion after all. Not silly at all, Elena said earnestly. Being able to keep doing something so meaningful, you're truly a good person. Just then, the same familiar scene played out again. A wasp suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Elena startled and stumbled, and the blonde herbalist once again caught her in his arms. The instant his hand touched her shoulder, that same familiar icy chill returned, leaving Elena secretly puzzled. There really might be something off about this guy. Back in her room, her team of maids had uncovered something suspicious. Every time the blonde herbalist visited, a maid would end up quitting. Ever since he'd started supplying the herbs, the number of resignations kept climbing. And all those maids happened to be from out of town. Those who'd spent more time around them noticed 6 more strange details. They looked deeply uncomfortable, were often nauseous, and kept muttering to themselves that it couldn't be. After hearing all of this, a bigger plan began forming in Elena's mind. So she decided to take a real risk and knocked on the man's door with a bottle of strong liquor in hand. I have a lot on my mind I'd like to get off my chest. Would you drink with me for a bit? The blonde herbalist startled. To set a dim, intimate mood, the first thing Elena did upon entering was draw the curtains shut, then fill both their glasses to the brim. What's weighing on me is a little hard to put into words. But you're the only outsider here, so I wanted to confide in you. Hearing this, the man solemnly promised he'd keep whatever she said today strictly between them. The two of them kept trading toasts back and forth, and before long, the blonde herbalist was well on his way to drunk. Watching this unfold, Elena secretly rejoiced. That was when she finally learned the truth. So it turned out the blonde herbalist had concocted a certain herb that let a woman conceive without ever being intimate with a man. And the drug had already been tested on the very maids in the household. Hearing this, Elena froze in shock, rooted to the spot. Only now did she understand why those maids had been throwing up, why they kept muttering over and over that it couldn't be. The truth was, despite never having been intimate with any man, they'd ended up pregnant all the same. The blonde herbalist swirled the wine in his glass. You must want desperately to bear an heir for the Duke. But you don't want to carry a monster's child, do you? He actually understood that feeling all too well. Because in his own youth, his father had abandoned him and his mother. After that, the mother who'd once been so gentle and kind suddenly turned volatile, quick to rage, and forever resented the son who carried that man's blood in his veins. Even on her deathbed, she never stopped cursing him. From that day on, the blonde herbalist swore he would put a stop to more people like himself ever being born. To bear a child carrying only your own bloodline, isn't that every woman's lifelong wish? Hearing this, a cold sweat broke out over Elena. This man wasn't simply a criminal anymore. He was a genuine lunatic. She felt a wave of fear, but forced herself to stand, keeping up an air of calm. With the evidence already in hand, she had no desire to stay here another second. Just as she turned to leave, the blonde herbalist suddenly seized her wrist. You're clearly quite drawn to me, and yet you plan to just walk away. Elena froze, forcing down her nausea. You're drunk. The blonde herbalist gently stroked her pale, delicate hand. These past few days, whenever you were around me, you always looked at me with such affection in your eyes. Bearing that monster's child must be miserable. Wouldn't it be better to be with me instead? Then our child would inherit his title. Just be careful and he'll never find out. With that, he grabbed a vial of stimulant and downed it without hesitation, then slowly leaned in closer to her. From the very first time I saw you, I've thought, a beauty like you is wasted on that monster. Hearing the word monster again, Elena was furious enough to see red, but the blonde herbalist kept right on hurling out provocations, completely oblivious to the change sweeping over her face. The very next second, she drove a kick straight into his face. Who's a monster, huh? Still running your mouth? You piece of trash, how dare you set your sights on someone's wife? He is not a monster, he is my husband. She screamed as she rained down blow after blow on him. The blonde herbalist grunted in pain, then clamped down hard on Elena's small hand, and forced her into his arms. Today I'll make you carry my child. Right at that moment, the door was kicked open. A maid burst in leading a squad of soldiers. Only then did Elena finally shake off her panic. Luckily, she'd told the maid beforehand, if she didn't come out within an hour to bring help at once. Otherwise, the consequences would have been unthinkable. Though restrained, the blonde herbalist still denied every accusation. He insisted he'd only been experimenting on maids in general, conveniently leaving out that they belonged to the ducal household, and demanded to be released immediately, promising in return not to pursue the matter further. Hearing this, Elena's mind went blank. She'd let her guard down, never expecting the blonde herbalist to be this shameless. Just as she was about to argue back, Caden suddenly spoke up. Throw him in the dungeon. Whatever happens next, I'll take full responsibility. Elena looked up at her husband. He didn't doubt her for a moment, nor blame her for her recklessness. Instead, he trusted her completely, no questions asked. For some reason, an indescribable warmth welled up inside her. In just a single night, her husband had shown both remarkable ability and an iron resolve. The maid also filled Elena in on the whole story. It turned out the blonde herbalist had never actually possessed a drug that caused pregnancy. To frame the monster duke as a man cursed by ill fortune, he'd bribed the ducal physician into falsely diagnosing the maids as pregnant, all to stir up public opinion and force Caden out of his position. Hearing this, Elena slammed her hand on the table in anger. She'd never imagined that such a small matter could conceal such a massive conspiracy. Luckily, the physician had already been caught and her husband had had his limbs severed. And based on his testimony, the blonde herbalist too was about to face proper punishment. With the whole affair seemingly settled, Elena looked back on a detail she'd overlooked, and how her husband had caught it right away. Proof that he was sharp, not clumsy in the least. Since that was the case, Elena decided to take one more gamble. She pushed her husband back against the wall and leaned her face slowly closer to his. I want to ask you something. The reason you won't get close to me, is it because you're afraid your curse will spread to me? Hearing this, Caden fell silent for a long while, saying nothing. A firm resolve shone in Elena's eyes. If her husband nodded, she wouldn't hesitate to sleep with him right there on the spot. But for some reason, an indescribable ache rose up inside her. She desperately wanted to tell her husband that she wasn't afraid of those rumors at all, that all she wanted was to bear him a child, and then spend the rest of their lives together, happily. But the words caught right at the edge of her lips, and she couldn't force them out. After what felt like an eternity, Caden finally spoke, slow and quiet. "It's not that." Hearing this, Elena pressed him again and again to be sure, and once she'd gotten a firm confirmation, she let out a long breath of relief. So it wasn't for that strange reason after all. Then he must have some hidden pain he wasn't comfortable sharing. "I'll wait for you. As for why you won't get close to me, I won't ask again, since you're clearly not going to tell me anyway. But I am your wife." With that, Elena turned to open the door and leave. But Caden suddenly caught her hand. "My lady, would you let me see your arm?" Hearing this, the girl froze. She knew exactly what he wanted to see, and quickly tried to change the subject. The man immediately sensed something was wrong, his eyes full of anguish as he asked again, "Please, let me see your arm." Elena went stiff. This was the first time she'd ever seen her husband wear such an expression. Her arm moved on its own, extending toward him, revealing a large patch of bruising. It was the mark left behind from when the blonde herbalist had forced himself on her. Caden stared at it for a long while without speaking. The girl pulled her arm back, muttering under her breath. How did he even know she was hurt? The man watched her quietly, unable to keep the anger from rising inside him. "You'd risk your life just for something like that. Do you have any idea how close you came to losing your innocence?" Elena said nothing, but she didn't feel she'd done anything wrong. All she'd wanted was to expose the blonde herbalist's crimes. She'd only meant to keep her husband from getting hurt. The more she thought about it, the more wronged she felt, tears welling unbidden in her eyes. She cried out, voice thick with frustration, "I thought if I did something great, we could finally be together like that." The words left Caden utterly stunned. Once she'd calmed down, Elena froze too. Had she lost her mind? Why had she said that out loud? But since it was already said, she might as well go all in. "Come to my room tonight and put the ointment on me." She'd fully expected him to refuse. But instead, he nodded without a moment's hesitation. That afternoon, the blonde herbalist finally confessed to every last one of his crimes. The number of victims had reached a full 40. As for his reasons for doing it, none of that mattered anymore. But watching her husband's serious expression as he applied the ointment, she found herself lost in thought. 4 months had passed since she'd married into this family, and her husband had slowly changed, from always keeping his distance to now allowing far closer contact. Though the two of them still hadn't consummated their marriage, Elena still felt genuinely happy. Her husband was stubborn, always insisting he didn't love her, but she could tell the door to his heart had long since opened for her. Whenever something went wrong, he was always the first to step in front of her. And whenever she got hurt, he always tended to her with the same care as this time. The candlelight flickered gently in the breeze. Watching her husband still muttering complaints at her, Elena broke into a smile. A truly happy one. "Let's make a baby tonight. I'll give you 100 of them." The girl counted on her fingers. 5 a year. 15 years straight should do it. Caden laughed at her adorable silliness, teasing that even pigs were more productive than her. But in truth, he understood perfectly well. His wife was only playing the fool to keep him from worrying. Yet a second later, he regretted it, because his wife had already drifted off into another daydream, imagining their child growing up to save the entire world. Seeing this, Caden hurried to switch off the light. Elena perked right up, but before she could say a word, he'd already turned her down with a dead serious look. "I haven't even said anything yet." She rolled her eyes in annoyance. Fine, I get it." She turned her back to him. "I'll let you off just this once tonight." Her plan to knock him flat had failed yet again, so let's talk about something else then. Truth be told, Elena had always been curious how that pregnancy-inducing drug was actually made. After all, creating life was practically a power reserved for the divine. Caden said he wasn't sure either, only that it involved the blood of some kind of beast. The two of them talked for who knows how long, until he turned to look at her, and found his wife's thin lips parted slightly, clearly asleep, and looking utterly beautiful in her slumber. The sight made him want, without even realizing it, to lean in and kiss her. Pushing aside such wandering thoughts, Caden slipped quietly out of the room and pulled out the recording orb that had captured his wife's conversation with the blonde herbalist. Listening back to it, he could feel with total clarity just how vile that man's intentions had been. "Let go of me!" An angry shout suddenly rang out from the orb. "Don't call me your lady, only my husband Caden has the right to call me that." He is not a monster, he is my husband." Each of his wife's heart-wrenching cries echoed on, and the man's eyes reddened before he even realized it. How long had it been since he'd last felt warmth like this? Perhaps it was the heavens taking pity on him, or perhaps it was simply fate. In that moment, all the grievances weighing on his heart turned into countless points of starlight, quietly dissolving into the night. The next morning, at a gathering of nobles over morning tea, a lady in red dropped an absolutely explosive piece of news. Word was, the night before, while the blonde herbalist was being escorted away, a monstrous beast had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The creature hadn't taken his life, but had instead targeted his lower body directly, leaving him permanently incapable of ever fathering children. From now on, anyone who ran into him could just call him one of the girls. The news reached Elena's ears before long, and she was overjoyed. A man like that deserved exactly that kind of suffering. She hurried off to find her husband, eager to share the good news with him. But the moment they met this time, she could clearly sense something different about him. The scenery in the garden was lovely, but Elena couldn't help wondering why her husband had suddenly invited her out here. Did he have something to tell her? Since the night before, she'd noticed him looking weighed down and pensive. At first, she'd assumed it was just work and thought nothing of it. But now, that heavy atmosphere left her feeling strangely uneasy. "My lady, aren't you afraid being alone here with me?" The question left Elena utterly confused. "What is there to be afraid of? Do you plan on doing something to me out here?" "Like what my own brothers do. Teasing me endlessly all day long. But even so, I just fight back anyway." Caden's worldview crumbled once again at his wife's words. So family could treat each other that way too. He insisted he'd never do such a thing to his wife. As for her husband, Elena already knew perfectly well he wasn't the type to do anything like that. Besides, with those long, powerful legs of his, even if she wanted to knock him down, she doubted she could manage it. What a shame, really, she'd never even gotten to touch those endlessly long legs. Right after that, Elena's body moved before her mind could catch up. Caden startled too. Why was his wife touching him without so much as asking first? Sensing things were getting awkward, she quickly changed the subject. "So you don't intend to tease me? Then why should I be afraid being near you? It's only that everyone keeps their distance from me because of that curse." Caden had grown up under cold, distant stares since childhood, so he'd long grown used to how the world looked at him. But his wife was different, and he honestly couldn't understand why. "That curse again." Elena started to grow impatient. "Do you really think those marks on your skin could spread to me? Because if they could, I'd actually think that's a good thing, since something contagious means it's a disease, and diseases can be cured. They're just a few marks. Why call it a curse at all?" His wife's words sent waves crashing through the depths of Caden's heart. He clenched his hand into a fist, the knuckles standing out clearly, and finally decided to explain why he'd never dared to get close to her. Of all the places in this castle, he loved the Eastern Garden most. As a child, the gardener in charge of that spot had always been rather lazy, so the weeds, tall as his waist, grew wild and tangled, thick enough that a child hiding in there would go completely unnoticed. Whenever he didn't want his family to find him, he'd hide away in that patch of weeds. He didn't truly believe he carried a curse capable of harming others. But whether it was a curse or not, his own child might very well bear the same marks from the moment of birth, so he'd never once considered leaving behind an heir. If his wife, for whatever reason, wanted a child especially badly, then he could only offer his apologies. Hearing this, Elena finally understood. Her husband had invited her out here just to say all this. He didn't want children because his own childhood had been anything but happy. Though he didn't bring up the subject again, that sorrow drifted through Elena's heart like a gentle breeze, then took root deep within her soul. Elena began to regret everything she'd done. Before she'd ever truly understood her husband, she'd forced her own wishes onto him without a second thought. She'd never once stopped to consider their future child, whether the marks might pass down to it, what kind of childhood it would have. She'd overlooked every bit of it. She'd simply assumed that once she had a child, her mission to save the world would be complete. But that child wasn't just meant to be a hero. It would also be her and her husband's own son or daughter. Thinking about the fact that she was soon to become a mother, Elena couldn't hold back the surge of emotion in her heart. That's right. She would give everything she had, pouring every ounce of love into protecting her child. If anyone dared to speak ill of it, she'd teach them a lesson they'd never forget. But first, she needed to win her husband over. Suddenly, Elena realized something. Her husband opening up like this today, did it mean he'd started to trust her? Could it be that last time she'd put herself in danger, it had actually moved him? Perhaps Elena could wait a little longer, until the trust between them ran deeper, until Caden truly trusted her completely, and then she'd tell him about that tragic future, and even how to change it. But plans couldn't keep pace with events. The very next day, Elena heard from the housekeeper that her husband was preparing to file for divorce. In that instant, it felt as if she'd been struck by lightning. So it had all been her own wishful thinking. Her husband hadn't shared his story out of trust. But as one final act of tenderness toward her, Elena couldn't bring herself to believe it. She stormed off to find her husband and confronted him, furious. "Do you really want to divorce me? Do you really want to throw me out of this place? You find me that much of a burden, don't you?" Seeing his wife arrive and fire off 3 questions in a row, crying with such raw hurt, Caden felt as though a blade had struck straight through his heart. He hurried to explain. That wasn't the reason at all. It was that he could see how desperately she wanted a child, and he simply couldn't give her that. So he'd assumed she no longer wished to keep this marriage going. Rather than leave her stuck in an awkward position, he'd rather bring it up first himself. Struck right at her weak point by her husband's words, Elena suddenly lost all her confidence. What he'd said wasn't wrong. She truly did want a child badly, but even so, she'd never once considered divorce. Even if she had to tie him down herself, she would keep him by her side. And so Elena spoke to her husband with absolute resolve. "No matter the reason, from now on, I will never be the one to leave you. Please remember that, because I will never change my mind." Having made her stance clear, Elena still wanted to confirm her husband's true feelings. "Do you really want a divorce just for that reason? Or is there something about our marriage that doesn't sit well with you?" "That's not it. As my wife, you treat me too well, more than I could ever deserve." Elena was rather taken aback by what her husband said. Aside from that one time she'd helped expose the blonde herbalist's scheme, she couldn't recall doing anything else for him. Though still a little uncertain, Elena decided to trust her husband's words anyway. After warning him once more never to mention divorce again, she finally returned to her own room. That had been far too dangerous just now. If they'd actually divorced, what would she have left to save the world? Or even save herself? At this point, Elena realized she couldn't keep fixating on having a child. She needed to make her husband fall for her first, and only then think about the next step. And so the next morning, under her husband's watchful gaze as she left, Elena set off to visit her best friend's estate. Old friends reunited, both delighted and a little tearful. Ever since they'd each married, they'd never had a proper chance to meet. This time, Elena had come, hoping to see her close friend Rosalind and pick up a few tricks of romance from her. Since her friend was famous for being the heroine of love stories, every man who dated her fell head over heels, utterly infatuated. When Rosalind heard that her best friend couldn't even win over her own husband, she was so worked up she launched straight into a hellish training regimen. Elena didn't disappoint either, mastering it all in just a few days, ready to head home. Before parting ways, the two promised to keep exchanging letters to track each other's progress. The moment she returned to the ducal house, Elena meant to go greet her husband right away, but the housekeeper's flustered expression made her suspicious. After a quick wash to freshen up, Elena headed straight to her husband's bedroom. Unexpectedly, the guards at the door refused to let her in. A sense of unease rose within her. No matter what, she was going to see her husband today. Right then, the housekeeper came rushing over. He explained that the Duke had merely caught a cold and hadn't wanted to risk passing it to her, hence the guards. But Elena sensed things weren't quite that simple. She offered to take someone else's place tending to her husband, but the housekeeper firmly refused to give her that chance. Seeing both of them standing firm, unmoved, Elena had no choice but to pretend to give up. Once the housekeeper had finally left, she grabbed a lantern and crept quietly beneath her husband's balcony, ready to unleash her finest climbing skills. Luckily, she'd been quite the tree climber as a child. She was nearly at the top before long, and just when it seemed to be going smoothly, trouble struck. Elena's foot slipped, and her body tipped backward, losing all balance. In that critical instant, a pair of large hands caught her just in time. It turned out to be Caden. While she was still frozen in shock, he pulled his wife tightly into his arms. That dashing hero rescuing the damsel moment left Elena completely swept off her feet. Back inside the room, her eyes never once left her husband, staying fixed on the double doors he'd walked out of. Seeing this, Caden gestured for his wife to compose herself a little, then finally spoke. "If I hadn't noticed you, what would you have done? Do you realize you nearly got seriously hurt? It wasn't that bad. Even if I had gotten hurt, it would have healed eventually with treatment. As long as it heals, a broken arm or leg is nothing to worry about. What kind of logic is that?" Once he'd said it, Caden realized he'd gotten a little too worked up. No matter how worried he was, he shouldn't have raised his voice at his wife like that. This was also the first time Elena had ever seen her husband this angry, and she admitted she'd been far too reckless. She understood perfectly well. Compared to a wife he'd married less than 2 months ago, her husband would naturally trust a housekeeper he'd lived with for years far more. But she'd genuinely been worried about her husband, which was why she'd taken the risk of climbing through the window. If her husband worried she'd try something again, then Elena would promise him. This time she absolutely wouldn't force herself on him like before. But the more she explained, the more she noticed something wasn't right with her husband's complexion. Stepping inside, she discovered his forehead was burning hot like a piece of coal. Elena immediately laid her husband down, then looked around for something to bring down the fever. Right then, the housekeeper arrived with cold water and paused briefly upon seeing the lady there. But a moment later, catching the Duke's silent, permitting glance, he said nothing more and handed the item straight to Elena. If he'd known that, why had he even tried to stop her earlier? She muttered under her breath about the housekeeper's sudden change of heart, all while wiping down her husband, who was drenched in sweat. As she pulled off his shirt, she caught sight of a burn scar on his shoulder. Elena couldn't help but wonder. This scar looked like it was over 10 years old, but her husband would have only been 13 or 14 back then. How had he ended up so severely burned? Before she could think further, she had him roll over so she could wipe his back. But the sight before her froze her hand mid-air. Countless burn scars, layered one over another, left Elena utterly shaken, a wave of worry and heartache she couldn't hide welling up inside her. Caden saw it all and explained to his wife. Every one of these scars had come from fire. Every time his mother was humiliated in front of others because of him, she would come home and tie him up, then press fire against his back. Because only by watching him writhe in agony did her mood ever ease, even a little. As for his father, he'd only ever warned her not to leave marks anywhere visible, then looked the other way. Caden couldn't recall exactly how long it had gone on, only that the first time was when he was very small, and the last time was the day before his parents died. Hearing this, Elena's heart churned, countless words rising up, but her throat tightened and nothing would come out. Her body wouldn't stop trembling. Such a tragic past, and yet her husband had recounted it in such a light, offhand tone. How utterly hopeless must he have felt toward his own parents. However much she wanted to hold them accountable, the dead were beyond her reach. There was nothing she could do. When the man turned his head and saw his wife's eyes brimming with tears, he hurried to comfort her, saying it was all long past, that he'd stopped feeling anything about it ages ago, and that he'd only posted guards at the door because he was afraid she'd worry about him. Hearing this, Elena quickly wiped away her tears and had her husband lie back down. The instant her fingers brushed his skin, she found, for her husband's sake, one more reason to be determined to save this world. The next morning, when Elena woke up, a maid informed her that her husband had already gone out to work. Still a little worried, she decided to go check for herself, and happened to run into the housekeeper. He sincerely apologized for his rudeness the night before, then told his lady everything that had happened to the young master over the years. It turned out Caden's family hadn't died in an accident at all, but in a deliberate, premeditated murder. The mastermind was none other than Caden's younger brother, a second son so spoiled by his parents that his character had turned rotten, who had brutally killed a maid in the household. The Duke and Duchess, wanting to shield their youngest son, had used their long-standing reputation to announce publicly that the maid had simply gone missing. Just when they thought the matter had blown over, the maid's own brother happened to learn the truth of his sister's death, straight from the drunken mouth of the second son himself. Clearly the murderer, and yet the man had shamelessly turned the details of torturing someone's sister into drunken party chatter. Not long after that, aside from Caden, the Duke, Duchess, and youngest son all died in a carriage accident. And the one driving the carriage that day was none other than the maid's own brother. So this hadn't been a simple accident at all, but a brother's revenge for his sister. Hearing this, Elena couldn't help pressing the housekeeper further. Then why hadn't the truth been made public? Leaving her husband to bear the false reputation of a man who'd brought death to his own family, the housekeeper shook his head helplessly, saying it had been the young master's own wish, because he was forever racked with guilt for not having reported the truth about the coachman's identity to his family in time. As for the housekeeper himself, he considered himself the true mastermind behind it all, since every move the maid's brother had made had been quietly guided and assisted by him. He'd done it because he believed that pair of parents, worse than beasts, had no right to keep living in this world. Caden had known all of this from the start, yet he'd chosen to shoulder the entire burden alone. becoming the villain everyone shunned, just to protect the housekeeper and the maid's brother. Thinking of how her husband had grown up in such a brutal environment, and yet still kept such a kind heart, Elena found herself utterly won over by him. She comforted the housekeeper, who was clearly consumed with self-blame, telling him to keep his spirits up, and that she would absolutely use the truth to slap those who spread lies right in the face. So now there was something she had to accomplish. But after days of watching him closely, Elena nearly lost her mind. This man not only had no hobbies whatsoever, his entire life ran on just 2 fixed points. Every day he trained with his sword, then buried himself in his study. At this rate, even come the end of the world, she might never manage to squeeze a child out of him. The new trick she'd just learned had done absolutely nothing. So Elena moved on to her next plan, winning him over with a small gift. But her best friend had warned her, an overly expensive gift only puts pressure on the other person, while the most sincere gifts were usually handmade ones. But Elena understood her own limitations all too well. She was the kind of person who could embroider a rabbit and end up with something resembling a brown bear. Utterly hopeless with her hands, no way around it. After much deliberation, Elena decided to head out for the day and personally pick out a gift that alone would show real sincerity. But no sooner had she stepped off the carriage than she heard someone shouting about a thief. The maid immediately rushed forward to intervene, but the thief showed no sign of stopping. Elena shut her eyes and resigned herself to whatever might happen. But the thing she'd feared never came. Opening her eyes, she realized someone had already restrained the thief, and the young man who'd just stepped in so heroically was none other than the very guard she'd once wanted thrown out of the ducal house. It turned out that a few days earlier, while learning more about her husband's interests, Elena had overheard Thomas speaking disrespectfully about her husband. Not only that, he'd also dismissed all the effort her husband put into practicing swordsmanship every day, claiming that the Duke's brilliant swordsmanship was thanks to the marks on his face, which he believed were some kind of demonic gift. Hearing this, Elena had invoked her authority as the Duke's wife and used the heel of her shoe to teach him a lesson in manners. Afterward, Elena had even asked her husband to have the man dismissed. But unexpectedly, her husband had spoken up in the man's defense. Even though Thomas ran his mouth recklessly, he was an exceptionally loyal knight. Seeing how firm her husband was, Elena had let the matter drop. Never had she imagined that this same man would now become the one who'd saved her life. Looking at his still swollen right leg, Elena felt genuinely grateful to Thomas for stepping in to help. But she still wouldn't apologize for what had happened before, and if he ran his mouth recklessly again, she'd give him the same lesson as always. Once she'd finished talking with Thomas, it was already dark by the time she got back to the ducal house. Elena invited her husband to take a walk in the garden with her. Being able to walk side by side with him in such a charged, tender atmosphere made her grip tighter on the thing she held in her hand. She wondered whether her husband would like this gift. With her heart racing nervously, Elena took out a pair of pink cufflinks and personally fastened them onto her husband's sleeve. Under her husband's startled gaze, she spoke the thought weighing on her mind. "You don't have any hobbies, but I want to add a little more color to your life. From now on, let's build that up together, little by little. Let's start by making pink your favorite color." Right then, though neither of them realized it yet, a seed of love had quietly taken root in both their hearts. Before falling asleep, Elena gazed at her husband, lost in thought. Since their marriage, aside from the matter of having children, it seemed her husband had never once turned down a single request of hers. At first, all she'd wanted was to save the world. But somewhere along the way, without her even noticing, Elena had started caring about everything to do with her husband, sometimes even blushing, her heart pounding, unable to look him straight in the eye. His sleeping face was beautiful, though it looked far from comfortable, since every single time her husband slept fully, properly dressed. Elena genuinely hoped that someday he might feel comfortable enough to let his guard down in front of her. That alone would make her far happier. The next day, Elena woke up feeling utterly refreshed, because the night before, she'd dreamed about her husband's family. To vent her anger on his behalf, she'd spent the entire night punishing every one of them in her dream, until they were all left gasping their last breath. Good news always lifts the spirits, and Elena hoped that going forward, her mission to win her husband over would go just as smoothly. Just then, her husband delivered a piece of good news to his wife. That man had been completely reduced to a cripple, and his family had confined him to the territory for the rest of his life. Thinking of the miserable days ahead for that piece of trash, Elena felt thoroughly satisfied. What she hadn't expected, on top of that, was that this whole affair had turned her into something of an idol among every maid in the household. But there was one thing that still troubled everyone, and that was that they still hadn't figured out the ingredients of that pregnancy-inducing drug. No matter how harshly he'd been interrogated before, he'd stubbornly refused to reveal even the smallest clue. It could only mean the ingredient itself was something that couldn't ever be made public. And if it were ever discovered, his reputation would be finished for good. The moment she heard that, a maid startled so hard she dropped the tray she was holding, sending it flying straight at her mistress. Caden saw it happen and instantly threw up a hand to shield his wife. Elena was terrified, but luckily only her clothes got dirtied. As for those deadly, well-toned muscles of her husband's, they suddenly reminded Elena of what she'd actually come to ask. And she spoke up. "Have you been busy lately? Could you spare me a whole day?" Caden had no idea what his wife had in mind, but assured her he could always make time for her, any time at all. Elena froze. She hadn't expected him to agree so quickly. Perhaps it was only her imagination. But for a moment, she felt like her husband had grown gentler somehow. This wasn't the time to be daydreaming. Once the meal was over, Elena headed to the study, where she found a letter had arrived from her best friend Rosalind, asking how things were progressing between her and her husband. She carefully reviewed everything that had happened over the past few days. But so far, she didn't seem to have much to brag about. Luckily, at the meal just now, her husband had agreed to a date with her. Otherwise, she'd have had no choice but to skip the whole bonding phase and jump straight to physical tactics. Time was short, the mission urgent. Elena handed her reply to a maid, insisting it be delivered safely. With that done, she started planning the location for their very first date. She stayed up for 7 straight days and nights, torn endlessly between boating or attending a festival, then stayed up yet another night without even noticing. The housekeeper, watching the scene unfold, nearly burst out laughing. The person in question, utterly oblivious, was still lost in a dream, rowing the boat of love alongside her husband. Unable to bear watching any longer, the housekeeper woke his lady up, then looked at the sketches scattered all over the room and told her. The young master's parents, fearing ridicule from others, had never once let him attend a festival as a child. That single sentence instantly set Elena's temper ablaze. She immediately scrapped her original plan and switched to attending a festival with her husband instead. To save time, Elena decided to hire an archmage to help shorten the trip to the festival. Her husband was rolling in money anyway. Before long, thanks to the housekeeper's introduction, she found the renowned archmage Sydney, said to come from noble stock, and to be the master of the Black Tower, the Empire's magic institution, one who answered to no one, not even the Emperor himself. Clearly a man of both power and looks in equal measure, but Elena found something rather off about him. Too much free time breeds nonsense. Why climb so high just to make things harder, forcing her to shout herself hoarse calling for him? Just as Sydney was about to introduce himself properly, Elena blurted out, calling him Lord of the Black Tower. The man froze. That title didn't suit his image at all. He had no wish to be called that. Calling him Archmage or Archmage Sydney would do just fine. It was only then that Elena understood his earlier haughty attitude had all been for show. But she refused to change it. Lord of the Black Tower fit him well and was easy to remember. She wasn't switching. Reasoning with her got him nowhere, and Sydney nearly lost his mind. Lord of the Black Tower. Lord of the Black Tower. He was absolutely going to make this girl regret it. Seeing that stubbornness wouldn't work, he decided to retreat in order to advance. Sydney announced that this time he wouldn't charge a single coin. Surely that would earn him the title of Archmage at last. But the moment she heard the word free, Elena only perked up slightly, then immediately waved goodbye and walked off, leaving the Lord of the Black Tower standing alone in the wind. Come dinner time, Elena told her husband all about her day. She was quite curious how he'd ended up so close to the Lord of the Black Tower. Their personalities were worlds apart, but her husband didn't seem to want to say much, so Elena didn't press further. With her first date with her husband fast approaching, Elena couldn't sleep. She planned to go for a walk outside to clear her head before bed, and unexpectedly ran into one of her husband's young fans. Watching the boy train himself ragged late into the night just to catch up even a little to her husband, Elena enthusiastically offered him some advice. If catching up to the whole man felt like too lofty a goal, he could start by catching up to just his feet. And once he'd nearly gotten there, aim higher from there. Her proud, wifely little expression earned her no scolding at all, and instead reignited the fire of determination in the boy's heart. Just as Elena was basking in satisfaction, a burst of loud chatter caught her attention. It turned out to be a drunken knight dragging his comrade along to tell the tale of her husband's monster-slaying exploits. Elena perked right up with interest. and instantly materialized behind them like a ghost, coldly declaring that she wanted to hear it too. At first, the knight nearly wet himself in fright at the sight of his lady. But rarely did he get such a devoted audience, so he launched straight into his enthusiastic retelling. And so, utterly absorbed in the legend of her own husband, Elena found herself at her first date before she even realized it. This time, she'd put more care into her makeup than ever before. The only thing she regretted was that masks were mandatory at the festival. Wouldn't that just cover up all her hard work? Seeing this, her maid launched into an unbroken stream of compliments for her mistress. That masterful flattery left the maids nearby wide-eyed. Seemed like getting promoted required some serious training in flattery, too. Beside them, Elena instantly felt confident again and was just about to go find her husband. When Caden appeared outside her door, dressed impeccably, her husband really did look handsome today. He was even wearing the cufflinks she'd given him. Delighted, she spun around once and asked if she looked pretty. Caden answered without a moment's hesitation. "You look beautiful today." Getting an answer that fast left Elena a little taken aback. Last time, back in his study, her husband had been so flustered he couldn't get a single word out. After she pressed him for a while, Elena finally learned that had been the very first time he'd ever complimented anyone, and she'd been the first person to ever make him feel beautiful. In that instant, Elena's heart felt as if it had been filled with candy, sweetness beyond words. She started to feel shy, and quickly turned to tell her husband they should go find the Lord of the Black Tower and head to the festival. Just as they were about to set off, the housekeeper called her husband away for something urgent. Unable to put it off, Caden had to step away for a moment. As for Elena, the instant she laid eyes on the Lord of the Black Tower, her guard shot straight up. She couldn't shake the feeling he'd come to steal her husband away. Even though her husband had told her the two of them were close friends, she still felt his motives weren't entirely pure. Otherwise, why would a master of magic like him do unpaid labor for someone else? Sydney, for his part, was equally taken aback. He'd known Caden for so long, and this was the first time he'd ever seen his friend care this much about a girl. Just as Sydney was lost in thought, Caden returned. Now that everything was ready, Sydney immediately cast his teleportation spell, whisking the couple straight to the festival grounds. As the festival began, Elena and her husband officially embarked on their sweet little date, their very first date, and already the sweetness was off the charts. The night sky glittered with unusual brilliance. Moonlight spilled across his wife's face, leaving the man a little flustered. In Caden's eyes, quiet affection kept welling up. He reached out and took his wife's hand firmly, afraid that amid the crowded sea of people, he might lose the person who mattered most to him. The warmth passing between their two hands never let up, leaving Elena helplessly blushing. But her straightforward husband hadn't the faintest idea. He didn't know the first thing about spoiling a wife. He only knew that whatever she liked, he'd simply pay for it. Before long, the two of them had their arms full of purchases. But no matter how much they were carrying, their intertwined hands never once let go. Just then, a nearby stall caught Elena's eye. Chop through the log and win a valuable prize. The moment she heard that, she perked right up. The prize itself didn't matter. What she really wanted was to watch her husband look impressive. So Elena dragged Caden over to take part. The shifty stall owner, once he'd pocketed the fee, noticed how sturdy his opponent looked, and decided to play dirty, handing over a fake sword. That way, whatever broke certainly wouldn't be the log, it'd be the sword itself, giving him an excuse to demand compensation on top of it. Just as the merchant was congratulating himself on his own cleverness, a lion suddenly burst out of nowhere. Seeing this, Caden leapt onto the log in a single stride, then lunged straight toward the lion. In the blink of an eye, he swung his sword, and the once ferocious lion lay motionless on the ground. With the danger past, Elena rushed to her husband's side like a starstruck little fan. She knew for certain, wherever her husband was, danger simply couldn't exist. Caden hadn't expected his wife to trust him this much. Truth be told, the moment he'd picked up the sword, he'd known something was off. If he hadn't put his full strength into it, that fake blade never could have killed a lion. Caden glanced over at the merchant, who'd already been scared witless and decided not to pursue the matter further, since he had no wish to spoil his wife's good mood. Elena thought they might spend the whole rest of the evening this affectionate, but she never imagined that lovely atmosphere would end up ruined by some tactless man. She clearly had no idea who this man was. Yet he came over with his wife in tow, chatting her up as though they were old acquaintances, and in doing so, accidentally revealed Caden's true identity. Whispers about her husband immediately rippled through the crowd. Elena hurriedly pulled her husband away from the gossip. At first, she'd been secretly relieved that no one had recognized her husband. That way, the two of them could enjoy themselves freely. But looking at the situation now, it seemed that wretched man had ruined everything. Though she desperately wanted more memories with her husband, if word of this spread, they'd surely be swarmed by a bunch of insufferable nobles. So Elena suggested they head home. Caden understood she was worried about him becoming the subject of gossip, which was why she wanted to leave so quickly. He reassured her that he was perfectly fine, but Elena simply couldn't accept that. If she ever caught anyone daring to gossip openly about her husband, she'd yank the hair out of any woman and make sure no man ever had children again. Caden couldn't help but laugh at his wife's words, though he wasn't exactly on board with that particular punishment for the men. Elena blushed and said nothing more, but privately thought, well then, let's hurry home. Just then, Caden noticed a play was about to begin nearby. He suggested they go watch. If they just sat through the performance, none of what his wife was worried about would happen. Elena had no objection. After all, their date wasn't over yet. But from the moment the play began, all the way until the curtain fell, Elena remained utterly shaken, because every bit of the play's content matched, scene for scene, the apocalyptic vision she'd once seen in her dream. She sought out the local lord, wanting to meet whoever had written this script. But the Baron informed her that the script had been penned by a young wandering poet, and tracking her down would take some time. With her husband's consent, Elena decided to stay behind and wait for word from the Baron. After the two of them checked into their room, Elena felt deeply guilty. Her own personal matter had eaten up her husband's time. Caden told his wife not to worry about that. He was more concerned about her than anything else, since her expression had looked off ever since the play ended. Elena started to speak, then thought better of it. All she could offer was that the script might have been written by an old friend of hers, which was why she'd lost her composure like that. Afterward, Elena noticed a bottle of red wine on the table, and immediately filled her glass to the brim, determined to drink herself into oblivion. But her husband seemed less than pleased, watching her with wary eyes. Only then did Elena realize just how much of a lasting scare her past antics had left on her husband. She swore up and down that she wouldn't do anything reckless. Caden grew flustered again. In truth, he wasn't afraid of his wife causing a drunken scene at all. He'd simply noticed she was in a bad mood, and didn't want her drowning her sorrows in wine. But seeing how endearing she looked just then, Caden gave in anyway. But the very moment the wine touched her lips, Caden instantly sensed something was wrong. His wife's glass had been drugged. He immediately shot to his feet, and threw the window wide open. Elena had no idea what was going on. Her husband patiently explained, "In a little while, you're going to feel very hot." Elena didn't believe him. She was dressed lightly enough already. How could she possibly feel hot? Cold? Maybe, but not hot. But no sooner had she said it than she realized reality wasn't matching her words. Her whole body was already burning with discomfort. Seeing this, Caden squeezed his eyes shut and told his wife their wine had been drugged. Hearing this, it suddenly dawned on Elena. It had to have been that Baron's doing. But by now the drug had already taken hold. Her entire body had gone limp, with no strength left at all. Caden ached for her, gently warning her not to move too suddenly, or the dizziness would only grow worse. But the moment her husband's hand touched her skin, Elena instantly felt a tingling numbness, a sensation even stronger than her dizziness. Sensing how dangerous this man was, she reached to push him away, only to find her feet had already left the ground. Watching the double bed draw closer and closer, Elena couldn't help but let her mind wander. Could it be her husband's thick-headed stubbornness had finally cracked? But it didn't take long for her to realize she'd been overthinking things. Her husband simply wanted her to lie down and rest on the bed. But she was curious about one thing. How had he known so instantly that the wine had been drugged? Caden explained that he'd been through something similar himself before. Once, on official business, he'd stayed a few days at another territory, and the lord there had given him drugged wine as well. Since almost no drug ever seemed to affect him, it had taken him quite a while to realize he'd been poisoned at all. Anxious, Elena pressed him further. What had happened to the woman that Lord had eventually sent into his room? When he told her he'd sent the woman straight back out immediately, Elena finally settled back onto the bed, relieved. But having sat up too quickly, the room spun around her again. Still, that didn't stop her from silently cursing that Baron in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her restless heart kept pounding wildly in her chest. The memory of her husband's touch just now lingered vividly in her mind. Elena quickly scooted away from him. Seeing her husband's bewildered expression, She explained earnestly that she was doing this to protect him, since only this way would he know she'd truly changed. Time kept slipping by, moment by moment. Elena's awareness was slowly slipping away. She grabbed hold of her husband's sleeve, muttering over and over that it was too hot. Caden seemed to sense what was happening, and stepped over to the window, tearing the curtains down entirely. But the moment he turned back to her, Elena was already thrashing, insisting it was really too hot now. She absolutely had to strip off her clothes. Caden understood this was simply the drug's effect. It stripped away someone's judgment, much like being drunk. He was just about to calm his wife down, when she'd already started tearing at her own clothes. With no other option left, Caden had to wrap her up into a cocoon again, just like before. That all-too-familiar scene helped Elena claw back a shred of clarity. Her husband must be some kind of ninja turtle, holding back even at a moment like this. Clinging to one last shred of hope, she begged him to free just one of her arms. Caden couldn't resist his wife's pitiful expression and untied one of her hands. Elena was overjoyed and clutched tightly onto her husband's hand, no longer as mischievous as she'd been moments ago, because an overwhelming drowsiness had already begun clouding her mind. The next morning, upon waking, Elena had absolutely no memory of anything that happened after she'd gotten drunk the night before. She didn't even know how she'd ended up in bed. And her husband stayed silent, never bringing it up. Early that morning, the Baron came to confess his fault, explaining that the drug had originally been meant for himself, but a newly arrived maid had mixed it up by mistake, which was how the whole mess the night before had happened. Elena hadn't expected the man to have such a strange preference, but seeing how sincerely he apologized, and that he'd even helped track down the wandering poet, she decided to let the matter go. What Elena never expected was that the poet turned out to be just a little girl, and that Veer also had the ability to dream of the future. Every bit of content in that script was something the girl had seen in her own prophetic dreams. The only real shame of it was that Veer's dreams came only in scattered, broken fragments, and only ever showed things that would happen within the next few years. Elena wanted to keep in touch with Veer for the long run, since aside from herself, Veer was the only other person who knew anything about the future. In the end, thanks to Elena's persistence, the two of them struck an agreement to keep exchanging letters with each other until the very day the world met its end. Once everything had been settled, Elena returned to the ducal house and picked her scheme to win her husband's heart back up. To help cultivate a hobby for her husband, Elena decided to personally teach him how to paint. Contrary to what one might expect, she'd always been quite confident in her own painting skills, and for their very first lesson, she planned to demonstrate her talent to set an example for her husband. But when it came to the final touch, the eyes, she found she had no blue paint suited to his clear, striking gaze. Elena thought it over for a moment, then made a bold decision. It was only a painting after all. Whatever the artist said it looked like, that's what it was. She then brought the finished piece before her husband. Caden looked at the painting of himself, a little startled. From what he remembered, he didn't think he looked quite like this. The figure in the painting gave off an oddly warm feeling. Could it be because of the pink eyes? Elena quickly explained. It was only because she hadn't had the right shade of blue on hand, so she'd used the color she knew best instead. Aside from the pupils and the marks, everything else was almost an exact match. Gazing at her own proud creation, Elena suddenly mused aloud. This person in the painting looked like a blend of both their features. Could their future child end up looking just like this? But she quickly realized she'd let something slip, since her husband was still very much against the idea of having children. She rushed to stand in front of the painting instead, announcing that starting tomorrow they'd officially begin their painting lessons, twice a week. Caden didn't answer right away, lost in a daze as he stared at the figure in the painting. Those pink eyes seemed to sear themselves deep into his mind. For one fleeting moment, Caden genuinely longed to have a child of their very own with his wife. But a child's future wasn't something to gamble on, and in the end, he snuffed out that impulsive feeling before it could ever take root. Still, Caden agreed to his wife's request, promising to work hard at learning to paint from then on. The next day, determined to be a proper teacher, Elena went out to buy some paint. The most important thing was that she absolutely had to capture her husband's eyes, deep and blue as the ocean itself. After wandering around all morning, Elena still hadn't found a shade of paint she was happy with. She decided to grab a bite to eat before continuing her search, never expecting that in a narrow alley she'd stumble upon a little girl being bullied. What left Elena even more stunned was that the victim's name belonged to someone she knew all too well. Elena immediately ordered Thomas to put an immediate stop to those two unruly children. while she herself hurried to the little girl's side, a child named Anna. The very instant that familiar face came into view, that terrifying prophetic dream from years ago came flooding back into Elena's mind. Wasn't this little girl the very same woman who, 20 years from now, would sacrifice her own life to help Elena escape a monster's attack? Though in the end, that woman hadn't managed to escape death herself, Elena had always carried deep gratitude in her heart for that couple, who dared to risk everything to save her in that moment of crisis. She never imagined that, under these circumstances, they would end up crossing paths once again. This time, it was her turn to protect the girl. But since the culprits were just two mischievous children, Elena merely gave them a light scare. And sure enough, the two little troublemakers burst into tears from fright, hurrying to apologize sincerely to Anna. Afterward, Elena took the girl's hand and bought her a huge amount of food. Right then, a little boy came running over, and the way Anna called out to him only made Elena even more certain that these two children before her were indeed the very same couple from her dream all those years ago. But why then were they living in such dire poverty now? Back at the ducal house, Elena intended to help ease Anna and Hans's impoverished life. But the housekeeper informed her that the two children had already been receiving support from the ducal house for some time. It turned out that when they'd first moved to the Duke's territory, their family had been attacked by monsters, and though the Duke had intervened in time, the children's father hadn't survived afterward to help the two little ones. The Duke had decided to provide for them. Elena came to realize perhaps the reason Anna and Hans had grown so attached to her later on was simply to repay the kindness her husband had shown them. Thinking of this, she went to find her husband. Watching his focused expression, an indescribable joy welled up inside Elena's heart. So it turned out some bond had already existed between them long before, and right now, she genuinely wanted to reach out and pat her husband's head to express the emotions swelling inside her. The very next moment, her hand had already, without her realizing it, landed on top of her husband's head. Elena, flustered with embarrassment, quickly pulled her hand back, just about to explain herself. When Caden lifted his head to look at his wife and said gently, "About that, you didn't actually have to hide it. A monster everyone else despised. And yet she'd fought to be the one to marry him, not even hesitating to use herself as bait, just to help her husband root out a criminal in his own territory. Though they'd ultimately succeeded in locking that scum away, it left behind a whole string of hidden consequences. Ever since Yinkan had been imprisoned within the territory, the resentment inside him had only grown deeper by the day. He'd clearly only been following his sister's orders when he tested that pregnancy-inducing drug on the maids, and yet, when everything had come to light, he'd never once given her up. What galled him even more was that his sister had now cast him aside without a second thought. No longer willing to just accept things as they were, Yinkan began threatening one of the household servants, forcing the man to sneak into the young lady's room and steal something out of it. The moment he had the item in hand, he set his plan for revenge into motion. Meanwhile, Elena, utterly oblivious to the danger closing in, went about her day as usual, getting ready to head out, and today, on a whim, she decided to try on the earrings the Lord of the Black Tower had once custom-made just for her. She'd heard these earrings didn't just shift color to match her outfit, but more remarkably still, they had a locator spell woven into them. The moment she put them on, Elena noticed the earrings' color genuinely change. Seeing something so magical for the first time, she decided to wear them out on the spot. The moment she reached the street, the first thing she did was go find Anna. Even though her husband had long since settled the girl's family situation, Elena still wanted to do something for her with her own two hands. Right then, a woman suddenly rushed over, frantically begging Elena's guards for help. It turned out a pack of monsters had appeared near the territory, and the regular guards simply couldn't fend them off, so the woman had come begging the ducal guards to lend a hand. Elena told Colin to hurry over and help, while she'd wait right where she was. She then crouched down and comforted Anna, a girl who had once lost her father to a monster. But thinking it over carefully, Elena felt something about all this seemed a bit too coincidental, so she took off her earrings and told Anna to rush them straight to the Duke. No sooner had she settled that than she felt as if a pair of eyes were locked on her from behind. At the same time, a foul stench began drifting around her, and she covered her nose, trying to shut it out. The very next second, her maid was knocked unconscious by two men dressed in black. Looking closer, it turned out to be none other than that scum Yinkan. He wore an eerie, sinister smile as he approached Elena. "I've no wish to harm innocent townsfolk, nor do I want to be rough with you. So if you know what's good for you, come along with me quietly." Elena looked at her maid, unconscious in his grip, And though she wanted nothing more than to slam a fist into him, she couldn't risk an innocent life over it. In the end, Elena had no choice but to comply. The entire way there, her mind raced. Hadn't he been sentenced to life imprisonment? Could it be he'd somehow found a way to escape just to pull this off? Suddenly, a tavern by the roadside caught her attention. She remembered a guard once mentioning that mercenaries without a job tended to gather at taverns, and a plan to save herself sparked instantly in her mind. Elena then pretended she was about to throw up, demanding he pull the carriage over immediately. She needed to get out and deal with it, or else she'd be sick right there in the carriage. The moment it stopped, Elena bolted out, pretending to retch while quietly scanning her surroundings. Yingkan, standing beside her, urged her to hurry it up. Elena, in turn, snapped back fiercely. If he wanted her to behave for the rest of the journey, he'd better buy her something refreshing to settle her stomach, like something from that tavern over there, for instance. Yingkan, eager to just get it over with, tore off his coat and draped it over her, warning her not to try anything. Once she'd bought her beer, she was to march straight back to the carriage, and if she caused any more trouble, he wouldn't be so accommodating next time. But this had all been part of Elena's carefully laid plan to make a clean getaway. She'd found an excuse to lure him into the tavern in the first place. Scanning the room, she realized running away outright simply wasn't an option, so that left only Plan B. Elena then pulled out her jeweled hairpin and, vouching on her own family's name, shouted to every mercenary in the tavern, "Whoever catches that wheat blonde-haired man for me gets 1,000 gold coins." Instantly, the whole tavern erupted into chaos. Yingkan froze at the sound of it. So her whole beer request had just been a ruse, and he'd fallen for her trick yet again. Memories of every past humiliation came rushing back to him at once. Yingkan's fury exploded instantly. In the blink of an eye, he'd taken down every mercenary who charged at him. Elena froze in shock. Why had this piece of trash suddenly grown so powerful? A knot of worry twisted inside her. Truth is, I'd meant to take this power and go live quietly in another country. But strangely enough, I just couldn't stop thinking of you. With that, Yingkan advanced step by step toward Elena. He'd once believed all he craved was revenge, but seeing her again now, he finally understood. He'd fallen for her all along. But Elena was utterly repulsed as he drew closer, the stench radiating off him, turning her stomach. Yingkan's fury flared. Am I truly that repulsive? Is this how the Duke's own wife treats me? But just as he tried to close the distance further, he was suddenly thrown back by a burst of white light erupting from Elena's own body, sending him flying several meters away. Even Elena herself stared, stunned, at the hand that had just released that surge of energy. But she quickly realized she needed to get out of there immediately. The moment she stepped outside, one of Yingkan's men blocked her path. Elena instantly swung her arm, aiming a slap straight at his face. But the man was built like a wall, and in the end it barely amounted to a friendly pat. Right after that, Elena transformed into a husky of sorts, sinking her teeth relentlessly into the hand gripping her. Once done, she also delivered a few finishing blows to his underling for good measure. Only once he could no longer crawl back up did Elena finally break into a mad dash. But not knowing which way to go, she ran until she was gasping for breath, without a single guard in sight. Suddenly, a large hand seized a fistful of Elena's hair. A sharp pain shot from her scalp, forcing her to grit her teeth. But Yingkan's anger still hadn't cooled in the least, and he slammed her down onto the ground without hesitation. I did warn you not to play with fire. If you'd just behaved a little, wouldn't that have been better for the both of us? With his hand clamped tight around her throat, Elena could barely breathe, feeling as though she'd black out any second, and right as she was about to give out entirely, a warm drop of blood fell onto her face. It turned out the hero she'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Every time he went out, her husband always wore his mask, and yet this time, he'd forgotten it entirely. He must have been worried out of his mind to rush over like this. Elena desperately wanted to call out her husband's name, to tell him she was fine. But for some reason, his voice kept growing fainter and fainter, and her eyelids kept sinking lower and lower. Before long, she'd shut her eyes completely. But strangely enough, when Elena opened her eyes again, she found herself once more before the old woman who'd foretold the future. Everything felt far too real to be a dream, and before she could even react, the old woman spoke first. You have completed the first awakening, though you'd already met the conditions. I never expected the opportunity to arrive at this particular moment. Elena was utterly lost. What did she mean by the first awakening? The old woman told her not to dwell on it, since she'd forget this entire conversation the moment she woke anyway. She could only tell Elena about the future that had already been set. Nothing more could be revealed, for that was simply the rule. Each person's fate had to be shaped by their own hand, and she had already interfered far too much. She could go no further. With that, the old woman rested a hand on the girl's forehead. I only hope the ending turns out differently this time, that you succeed in preventing mankind's extinction. Only then will your child's sacrifice not have been in vain. The instant his wife fell into danger, her husband's heart nearly leapt straight out of his throat. The woman who'd always been so full of life and energy now lay unconscious before him. Caden had no idea when his wife might wake again, his eyes brimming with worry and quiet anguish. Feeling the lingering warmth still left in his wife's hand, memory after memory from the past came flooding back. Since childhood, Caden had already seen through the coldness of the human heart. He knew that the cursed marks on his face meant he was destined never to receive the same love his younger brother did. And yet his heart, starved for affection, kept reaching toward that warmth all the same. He told himself again and again, even a false kind of love was still love, as long as he never exposed his parents' lie and endured whatever painful treatment came after. Perhaps he'd still get to feel a brief flicker of warmth. But reality seemed to mock his naivety at every turn. How strange. No matter how much we burn him, it never leaves a scar on his skin. Maybe we should just get rid of him already. We can't do that. What if the curse spreads to us? That conversation between his parents struck his heart like a sharpened blade. The beautiful dream he'd worked so hard to build crumbled to pieces in that very instant. What else was there left to hope for? He needed nothing at all anymore. Throughout that dark, endless childhood, the only thing that ever stayed by his side was the sword in his hand. He'd once resented them, but never once thought of taking revenge on his own parents. But in the end, his parents and his brother all left him behind anyway. Gone forever, never to return. Caden knew full well the true cause of his family's death. Yet he had no wish to make that truth public, because by that point he no longer cared about anything at all. Not even the great matter of marriage. No matter how many times the other side swapped out the bride. To him, as long as it didn't threaten their arrangement, it hardly mattered who the bride was. The very first time he laid eyes on his wife, she'd struck him as a little rabbit, so adorable that anyone would want to protect her. Caden had once believed they'd remain husband and wife in name only, never anything deeper. But as time passed living together, he came to realize his wife was the kind of person who only grew harder to read, the more he understood her. She was quite willing to punish maids who gossiped behind his back, and never hesitated to run her hands along his face, even wanting at times to be truly intimate as husband and wife. At first, he'd assumed she only wanted their child to become the next duke. But looking at her, she didn't seem the least bit ambitious, nor like someone plotting anything at all. What struck him as even stranger was that his wife had once risked her very life for his sake. In Caden's dark, joyless life, this was the first time he'd ever met someone who valued him so much. But out of his own weakness, he'd used his wife's sincerity as an excuse, and after finally pouring out everything in his heart, he'd turned around and wanted to divorce her. Purely out of fear, he'd tried to end everything unilaterally, but his wife had told him, no matter what happened, she would never leave his side. And it was on that very day that Caden learned, for the first time, that when people are utterly overwhelmed with panic, they can find themselves momentarily unable to speak at all. He had no idea how to handle a feeling like this since no one had ever taught him. He'd laid bare his entire past to his wife, telling her so many things from before, and remarkably, once those old stories had finally been spoken aloud, something in him seemed to loosen, the memories no longer twisting his heart quite as sharply as before. His wife had done so much for him, even flying into anger over one harmless remark from a knight, as though she herself had been the one insulted. So many times Caden couldn't understand why his heart would suddenly start pounding so wildly. What kind of person was his wife really? Was she simply a good person? A remarkable one? Or someone he owed a great debt of gratitude to? She was the beloved mistress of the entire ducal house. But strip away the title of duke's wife, and Caden had asked himself countless times, did he actually need her? Probably not. Losing this woman would just mean his life reverted to how it had been before. Neither his work nor his emotions would be affected in the least. That was right, he didn't truly need this woman all that much. Even after Caden had reached that conclusion, for some reason, the question kept lingering in his mind regardless. Until the kidnapping happened. The moment everyone told him his wife was in danger, and the young girl arrived carrying the earrings to find him. Caden felt his chest pound like war drums unmistakably. The process of tracking down his wife's whereabouts felt like living through his own death. I must find her. Nothing must happen to her. Absolutely nothing. Even after she'd been rescued, lingering fear still gripped Caden. But it was precisely from that moment on that he truly understood his own heart. He mustn't let himself grow attached to things he didn't need. That rule, which had taken such deep root in his mind all this time, now looking back, seemed utterly absurd. He never should have concluded on his own that he didn't need her. Right at that moment, Elena woke from her coma. But why did her husband's face look like that? Caden, how long was I out, and what happened to that piece of trash, Yinkan? Faced with his wife's barrage of questions, Caden slowly began to speak. Elena, you once asked me if I needed you. So now, let me answer that question. Elena, I need you, so please don't get hurt again. Just stay by my side always. Ever since Elena had woken from her coma, her husband seemed to have turned into an entirely different person. Not only did he have a doctor come examine her every morning, noon, and night, but every time she finished her medicine, he'd sit right down beside her bed, peeling her favorite fruit for her to eat. Every single day, aside from his working hours, he stayed by her side almost constantly. Elena sighed helplessly. Could this be what people meant by a sweet burden? Even though Yinkan had nearly choked her to death during the kidnapping, she still understood just how worried Caden had been. It was only that seeing him so tense and anxious was something she'd truly never expected. She really wanted to tell him that a kidnapping like that could never have frightened her. After all, she'd once seen monsters devouring people alive with her own eyes, and the sheer despair of an entire world coming to an end. But whenever she recalled the image of her husband risking everything to save her, that anxious expression on the face of a husband who'd forgotten even his mask, it was something she found impossible to forget. The moment the doctor's routine checkup ended, she saw Caden come in carrying a plate of plump, juicy peaches. Elena's eyes lit up at the sight of her husband. Ever since becoming a patient, she'd been surprised to discover just how skilled her husband was at peeling fruit. Not only that, he could even carve the fruit into adorable little rabbit shapes. Even though eating fruit meant she'd have to down bitter medicine along with it. Seeing that adorable little rabbit, Elena found herself quietly enduring it anyway. She asked her husband to help pick out a new fruit for her, and watching Caden's thoughtful, focused expression, Elena suddenly felt an itch to reach out and pat his head. Out of nowhere, Caden leaned down, reaching his left hand toward Elena's smooth, pale face, gently wiping away a bit of fruit stuck at the corner of her mouth, and in that very instant, Elena felt as though she'd forgotten how to breathe. There, done, Caden gave a satisfied smile. The girl's face flushed instantly red, but he simply carried on as if nothing had happened, going right back to peeling the fruit in his hands, leaving his little wife's heart pounding away, unable to settle. 9 days later, the housekeeper came to report that Yinkan's body had mysteriously vanished. It turned out that, after Caden had struck him down with a single blow that day, his body had been brought back to the ducal castle for safekeeping. 2 days earlier, they'd decided to send the body to the capital to face judgment, since even though Yinkan was dead, the kingdom still upheld the punishment of beheading a corpse. That punishment could, in effect, kill Yinkan a second time, while also publicly announcing his crimes to the entire realm. But right along the road to the capital, the body had vanished without a trace, and a witness swore they'd seen the entire disappearance happen with their own eyes. A witness, you say? Yes, according to the testimony. Yinkan's body had suddenly melted away and vanished right before the witness's eyes. Elena found the whole thing utterly absurd. Could the witness have simply had too much to drink? That person had no reason to lie. And besides, the body had vanished while the clothes were left completely intact. Elena couldn't help but wonder, if this had been the work of thieves, there was no reason they'd have left behind nothing but the clothes. Right at that moment, the housekeeper offered up another theory. It seemed that, while still alive, Yinkan had learned some form of black magic. Black magic could only be activated through terrifying means, offering up human bodies, consuming human flesh, and the like. Merely learning it counted as a crime in itself, which was why it had all but vanished, passed down almost nowhere anymore. What's more, rumor had it that black magic went directly against the will of the heavens. Anyone who learned it would, upon death, be barred from ever returning to the embrace of the gods. Every trace of their existence in this world wiped away completely. So you're suggesting Yinkan vanished because he'd learned black magic? It's not clear yet, but we intend to look into this thoroughly. After the housekeeper left, Elena found herself recalling every detail from the last time she'd seen Yinkan. He truly had seemed strange back then, not only giving off that baffling stench, but also easily taking down several grown men. Not only that, his hands had turned an eerie shade of black at the time. Even when he seemed perfectly normal, something about him always felt deeply off. She still remembered how the last time Yinkan had been escorted back, he'd been badly wounded by a monster, even losing a vital part of his body in the process. And yet, given the severity of that injury, his rate of recovery had been abnormally fast. If all of this really did come from the power of black magic, then behind him, just what other secret could still be hidden? It turned out Yin Khan's body had been disposed of on the orders of his own sister, Rebecca. The instant she'd learned Yin Khan had escaped the territory again, she'd immediately sent an assassin to take his life, going so far as to have mourning clothes prepared well in advance, just waiting for that foolish little brother to conveniently die by accident so she could attend his funeral. The only shame of it was that the assassin arrived one step too late. Yin Khan hadn't just kidnapped the Duke's wife. In the end, he'd been killed by the Duke's own hand. And now the Duke had grown suspicious of the entire family, on top of dealing out a severe punishment. Rebecca's father was furious enough to jump up and down in rage, blaming his daughter for coming up with such a half-baked scheme, forcing Yin Khan to be confined within the territory, driving him to such a desperate corner that he'd lashed out in madness. Yet Rebecca's demeanor remained eerily calm, not a flicker of feeling over her own brother's death. She told her agitated father to calm himself, but the old man only grew more worked up the more he talked. "Enough!" Rebecca snapped, cutting him off sharply. "Please, father, just be quiet. Stop shouting. My head is pounding." The old man stared at her, utterly disbelieving. "What did you just say? How dare you speak to me like that?" The gem hanging on Rebecca's chest suddenly flared with an eerie, dazzling red-black light. The moment that light touched him, the old baron froze stiff on the spot, and within moments he seemed to lose every last trace of life, turning into nothing more than a puppet for her to control at will. Having dealt with her own father, Rebecca turned to go clean up the mess her brother had left behind. As for the Duke's wife she'd once kidnapped, that would simply have to wait for another opportunity. Elsewhere, Elena was trying hard to recall anything unusual from the last time she'd seen Yin Khan. She remembered how, in that moment, a burst of light had suddenly flared from her own hand. She'd used that very hand to push Yin Khan away, and it had sent him flying. As unbelievable as it sounded, she was certain that power could stand up against Yin Khan's own. And yet when she'd fought off his underlings, that same power hadn't worked at all. Perhaps that light only had an effect on Yin Khan specifically. Just as she was lost in thought, a maid stepped in to interrupt, announcing that the Duke had invited her to dinner. Hearing this, Elena's eyes lit up at once. Quick, tell him there's absolutely no problem. In the days that followed, Elena spent her time recovering within the ducal castle, while continuing to carry out her plan to win her husband's heart. Without even realizing it, she'd already completed the first 5 stages, the 6th stage being to create a shared secret between the two of them. That day, she'd seen the marks left on her husband's body, and had also heard the story of his childhood. Both of those certainly counted as his secrets, so the 6th stage could be considered complete as well. Next came the 7th stage. All she had to do was repeat any one of the things above. Originally, Elena had planned to invite her husband to take a walk by the lake together, but she remembered Caden's strict order, forbidding her from setting foot outside the ducal castle even once until her wounds had fully healed, and felt like crying without a single tear falling. She was now treated like a porcelain doll, with him worrying all day long that she might bump into something or scrape herself. Elena collapsed helplessly onto the bed. Though it was a bit overbearing of him, the moment she thought of the pained, tender look in her husband's eyes, Elena couldn't help but feel her heart flutter inexplicably. He had, after all, once told her he needed her. While Elena obediently recovered within the ducal castle, Sydney showed up to visit, his face looking utterly haggard, like the Walking Dead. "Hey there, were you out playing Ghost all night?" Elena looked at him, thoroughly puzzled, then made sure to thank him properly. Luckily, Sydney had cast a tracking spell on the earrings beforehand, or else the consequences could have been unthinkable. Unexpectedly, Sydney pulled out a large box, filled with all manner of magical tools, each one enchanted separately with spells for attack, defense, movement, and communication. They'd respond only to the voice of whoever wore them first. All she had to do was put them on and quietly recite the activation phrase, and they'd be ready to use instantly. Elena looked at the wizard rambling on in front of her, and couldn't help but ask the question she'd been holding back. "You didn't lose sleep just to make all this, did you? Why do you care about me so much?" "Well, actually, I looked into you. I heard you're famous for having a terrible temper. So even though you're a renowned genius, you've earned yourself the nickname Smelly Dog Turd. But the man everyone says is impossibly difficult turns downright obedient, like a little lamb in front of me. Whatever I ask of you, you help without a single word of complaint. And this time you even sacrificed your sleep just to make magical tools for me. Next, Elena asked a question that left him utterly floored. Do you like my husband that much? Sydney froze on the spot the moment he heard it. Never mind the Lord of the Black Tower being stunned. Even the narrator couldn't help but feel a little thrown off by that one. Girl, have you been reading too many trashy novels? Seeing two handsome men together and jumping straight to thinking there's something going on between them. Luckily, Elena hadn't meant it that way at all. By like, she simply meant the way friends care about each other. You've never had the slightest interest in me. What you actually care about is the title Caden's wife, nothing more. I know the two of you are close friends, but honestly, I feel like your friendship runs a little deeper than that. Elena remembered her husband once mentioning that Sydney had originally been a priest before switching over to become a wizard. The two of them had met purely by chance and gradually became true kindred spirits. But if that were really all there was to it, then Sydney's near unwavering loyalty toward Caden seemed a little strange. Faced with Elena's question, Sydney finally revealed the real reason. It turned out that back when he was still a priest, his life had been anything but easy, and it was the Duke who'd stepped in to help him, helping him leave the priesthood behind and successfully become a wizard instead. Seeing the shadow that crossed his face, Elena realized this was clearly an old wound Sydney didn't wish to discuss. She took the hint and didn't press further, choosing instead to thank Sydney all the more sincerely. Before he left, she also took the chance to ask him a bit more about black magic. Do you know anything about black magic? Does a black mage's body give off some kind of odor? Sydney thought it over carefully and concluded that no, it shouldn't, unless one very specific scenario applied. And that was if, while learning certain kinds of black magic, one had to keep a corpse nearby and effectively live alongside it. And moreover, it had to be a corpse that had already begun to decompose. Not only that, a black mage would need to live with that corpse for at least half a month before the smell would linger and become impossible to wash away. So is there any kind of magic that counters black magic? The kind where even a single touch would drain all of a black mage's power, leaving them completely spent. Unexpectedly, Sydney stated flatly, "There's no such thing." This left Elena rather taken aback. It seemed the power she'd used back then hadn't been a form of magic after all. After Sydney left, that evening, Elena had a pleasant dinner with her husband. The Duke found it odd, and asked why she seemed to be in such a good mood today. Well, it's because the Lord of the Black Tower stopped by during the day. He already knew about that, having heard that his good friend had prepared a whole stash of magical tools for his wife. That's right. And it's precisely because of that, suddenly receiving so many gifts all at once. I'm genuinely so happy. At this point, Elena had absolutely no clue what her husband was feeling and simply thought to herself, not bad at all. Seems like Sydney really is a reliable friend after all. Turning her head, she finally noticed her husband looking at her with an expression full of resentment. So this is why you're in such a good mood, all because of Sydney. Oh my goodness, Your Grace, are you actually jealous? The two of you are quite the pair. Elena had assumed Sydney had feelings for Caden, while Caden had assumed Sydney had feelings for her. Sydney, entirely innocent, got dragged into the middle of it. Fine then, can I leave now? That jealous Duke was truly a frightening thing to behold. Frightening enough that with just one squeeze of his hand, the once sturdy plate shattered instantly into pieces. Elena stared at the sight, dumbfounded, and quickly asked if her husband was all right. I'm fine, this plate just seems to have been poorly made. The oblivious Elena still had no idea just how jealous her husband was at that very moment. The next morning, waking up to find the room piled high with gifts, she nearly shot upright out of bed in shock. A young maid thoughtfully carried a gift box over to her, boasting that these were all items the Duke had specially prepared for her, and that the master had said she could use them however she pleased. With this many magical tools, it was enough to send her into battle all on her own. Just then, a young maid brought over a letter. The letter contained just one line out of nowhere, with no context at all. You weren't planning on forgetting me, were you? Elena was utterly baffled, unable to figure out who could have sent it. At this point, the doctor arrived for the routine checkup and declared Elena fully recovered. Her house arrest was lifted as well, and the girl was so overjoyed she forgot herself completely. Yeah. That meant from now on she wouldn't have to sleep alone anymore. She could finally sleep beside her devastatingly handsome husband again. But that night, once Elena lay down in bed, she realized she wasn't nearly as composed as she used to be. She snuck a glance at her husband lying beside her, and, right at that moment, he happened to be looking at her too. Elena seized the chance to strike up a conversation, telling him about what she'd encountered while out today. She had no idea what kind of rumor the old housekeeper had spread. But little Anna had somehow become a hero in everyone's eyes now. She'd heard the children who used to bully her were now bringing her flowers and treats. That's wonderful, really. Caden rolled over to face his wife. Really? Elena immediately fixed her eyes on him. Have you been really busy lately? No, not particularly busy. You're lying. I've heard all about it, aside from mealtimes. You spend every other moment in your study. There's nothing to worry about. There's just been a few things to handle lately. But once I'm done with them, everything should go back to normal. Then let's wait until you're free again and pick our painting lessons back up. It's nothing. Elena fidgeted her fingers a little sheepishly, then said rather bashfully, once you're not so busy anymore, let's go rowing together. Caden hadn't expected that the one thing his wife wanted most right now was that, rowing? Yes. Have you ever rowed before? No. So your first time would be with me too? Elena instantly perked up with excitement. I noticed a lake once. I heard it's a famous spot for rowing. Lots of couples go there. She quickly covered her mouth in embarrassment. Why had the word couples just slipped out of her so naturally? Anyway, it's bound to be fun. I'm looking forward to it, me too. Seeing her date plan succeed, the girl finally relaxed enough to say goodnight. Sleep well, Elena, her husband replied gently, then closed his eyes, ready to sleep. But not even 2 seconds later, he heard his little wife call out again, Caden, are you asleep yet? Not yet, if you'd like. Let's go for a walk outside. A gentle night breeze drifted through the moonlit garden, where a young couple strolled leisurely together. The girl laughed, her eyes crinkling with joy. But the very next second, she stumbled and lost her footing. Just as she was about to fall, a pair of large hands caught her in time. The Duke smiled at her gently. This garden is darker than you'd think. So take my hand. Elena blushed, unconsciously slipping her small hand into the large one before her. Their two hands clasped tightly together. Watching her husband's tender smile, the girl's heart had never pounded quite like this before. Her eyes stayed fixed on his captivating face, unable to look away for the longest time. At that very moment, a carriage was speeding toward the ducal castle. Inside, a somewhat anxious maid asked, Young master, is this really the best way to do it? The man answered, his face utterly expressionless. Is there any better way than this? Then he raised his voice, urging the coachman to go even faster. Elena, wait for me just a little longer. This time I will absolutely bring you back. In the quiet, moonlit garden, the young couple was still strolling hand in hand. Elena's heart had never raced quite like this before. Inside, she kept crying out to herself, Calm down, heart, just calm down. Caden had taken her hand on his own. Surely it was only because it was so dark, and he'd been afraid she'd fall. The man beside her seemed not to notice her flushed face at all, and asked gently if she wanted to rest for a bit. The girl answered without thinking, yes. But the moment her husband let go of her hand, an odd, hollow feeling of loss rose up in her chest. Can't sleep? That's not it. It's just that I've had a bit of insomnia today. The girl, usually so carefree, found herself strangely nervous just then. Her husband looked at her with such concern. If there's something troubling you. It's not that there's nothing troubling me at all. It's just seeing how carefully you look after me. Sometimes makes me feel like a porcelain doll. Even over something so small, you worry about me. There's no helping it, really. Caden couldn't help but recall his wife's past glorious achievements, and suddenly felt a slight headache coming on. The girl pouted, clearly unsatisfied. What were you about to say? Nothing. A soft rustling sound broke the silence, a dry yellow leaf drifting down onto the girl's forehead. Caden gently brushed it away. An idea suddenly sparked in the girl's mind, and she immediately thought of a clever cure for insomnia. Back in her room, Elena excitedly recounted how, as a child, whenever she cried and couldn't sleep, her wet nurse would tell her old fairy tales to lull her to sleep. But I'm all grown up now. I don't want to hear fairy tales anymore. I want to hear your stories. My stories? Yes, anything at all from your past that I don't already know. I want to hear every bit of it. Like the time you fought off monsters, or how you saved little Anna and little Hans. But those stories are so boring. That's fine. That's even better, actually. If the story's boring, I'm bound to fall asleep after just a little while. Of course, more than listening to a story, what the girl really wanted, truth be told, was to hear her husband sing her a lullaby. In the end, the Duke couldn't resist his little wife's request and began recounting his own story earnestly. Sure enough, before long, Elena had drifted off to sleep, lulled by the calm reassurance of her husband's voice. Noticing his little wife had fallen sound asleep beside him, Caden gazed quietly at her face for a long while. Since coming back, I've had you by my side. I've never before been around anyone so small and fragile. So when taking care of you, it's hard not to become unusually careful. Because I don't want you to ever get hurt, Elena. Early the next morning, the Duke summoned the old housekeeper. instructing him to finish up the acquisition of the trading guild as quickly as possible. He also had the housekeeper tell the maids not to wake his lady this morning, wanting his little wife to sleep until she woke naturally. And it was thanks to that thoughtfulness that, when Elena finally woke up, she felt utterly refreshed, wonderfully at ease all over. She stretched happily. Seems like listening to her husband's stories before bed really did work. From now on, he'd simply have to tell her a story every night. Just then, the old housekeeper came to report that a distinguished guest had arrived at the ducal castle. Elena could never have guessed that the distinguished guest who'd come to see her would turn out to be none other than her own brother. And there he stood beside the carriage, looking anything but pleased, his expression dark as he spoke. "Elena, I've come to fetch you myself. I'm taking you home. The whole family held a meeting after receiving your letter. We've been debating for your own safety whether or not we should bring you back home. After days of careful thought, Father has agreed to bring you back too. So stop wasting time, pack your things, and come with us." Watching her agitated brother, Elena felt nothing but a headache coming on. "So you're saying you want me to end this marriage and go back home for good?" "That's right." Elena flatly refused, but Edward remained just as stubborn. He'd always been convinced that Elena's kidnapping was entirely due to lax security at the ducal castle. "Do you even know where the kidnappers came from?" "They came from the capital. So this has nothing to do with the ducal castle at all." As Elena explained, she also had the maids bring out all of her magical tools. "Look at this. These tools alone are enough to rival an entire army. And there are these 3 strong, capable bodyguards too. So what's left for you to worry about?" Edward was clearly somewhat swayed, but stubbornly insisted he couldn't just stand by and watch. "Dear brother, I know you all genuinely worry about me, but as you can see, I'm perfectly safe here at the ducal castle, so I won't be going home, and there's no need for me to... I'll get you a room in a moment. It's rare for you to visit, so just relax and rest." Elena let out a sigh of relief, but Edward still wasn't ready to give up. He even went so far as to insist that what happened to Elena was somehow connected to the curse on the Duke. Elena was furious enough to slam the table right there. She'd hold a grudge even against strangers who spoke ill of her husband, let alone her own brother saying such a thing. Just as Elena was about to lose her temper, a deep, warm male voice spoke up. "So this is where you are. I heard we had a distinguished guest visiting, so I came to say hello," Caden said with a smile as he approached, as if he hadn't heard a word Edward had just said. "I hope I'm not interrupting the two of you." "Not at all. Not at all. You don't need to greet him anyway. He'll be leaving soon regardless," Elena cheerfully decided on her own brother's behalf. The Duke stepped closer, standing before his brother-in-law. "It's been a long time, Lord Edward Southwold. I trust you've been well lately." The Duke extended his hand. Edward, as if determined to compete, gripped back with all his strength. The outcome needed no guessing. There was no way a scholarly brother-in-law could ever match a brother-in-law who trained with a sword year-round. His face flushed red instantly, while Caden remained perfectly composed as though nothing had happened at all, then calmly instructed, "Your room's already been prepared. Please show our distinguished guest there." Having just lost that little contest, Edward looked utterly bewildered. "What? No. You two don't need to host me. I came here to take Elena home." By nightfall, Elena looked at her husband sternly. "You did that on purpose today, didn't you?" "What do you mean?" "I was just about to lose my temper with Edward when you happened to walk in." "That can't have been a coincidence, can it?" Caden lowered his eyes, hiding the complicated look within them, then nodded in admission. "Why would you do that? If you hadn't come in, I'd have already yanked out half of Edward's hair right there on the spot." Elena really had been provoked today. But the very next second, her clenched fist was caught by a large hand. "The reason I stepped in was because I was afraid you'd do exactly that. Because I didn't want you fighting with your family on my account, that's why I intervened. I wasn't even planning to fight with him." Elena suddenly felt a little guilty. "I only meant to dish out a little heavenly justice, teach him a lesson, that's all." An indescribable wave of surprise rose in the Duke's heart, watching his little wife who always seemed to think only of him. He couldn't help but let a happy smile slip through. "It's fine, Elena. As long as those words didn't come from you, I won't take them to heart, so there's no need to worry about it." Elena felt a sharp ache in her chest. How could he be like this? Her husband was always so kind. That's right. Back when Thomas had said equally reckless things. Had Caden ever once held it against him? It must be because he's long since given up hoping for anything. The more Elena thought about it, the angrier she got, silently adding one more mark against Edward in her heart. She held her husband's hand as they lay down, spending the whole night telling him about all the ways Edward used to bully her as a child. The next day, when she saw Edward again, Elena sternly warned him that if he still wanted to be considered her family, he was never to bring up her husband's curse again. Seeing his sister's serious expression, Edward had no choice but to obediently agree. Fine, but are you really not planning to come home? I already told you yesterday, I'm not going. Elena frowned and waved her hand dismissively. If you're worried about the contract... Speaking of which, Elena suddenly remembered that she'd originally married the Duke in her cousin's place. So Miel has agreed to come back and marry the Duke in your place. That's right. After thinking it over carefully, she feels you sacrificed yourself to suffer in her place. Elena found the whole thing utterly ridiculous once she heard it. Was this some kind of children's game, swapping out wives halfway through? Regardless, Edward remained just as insistent that Elena return to their parents' home. And Elena still gave the same 2 words in reply. Refused. The siblings remained at this standoff for several days, with Edward staying at the ducal castle the whole time. Until one day, Edward pulled Elena aside, saying he wanted to have a serious talk with her. You may have a short temper, but you've never once had any real ambition. You've never once demanded anything, never complained about anything, never once been greedy for anything at all. And yet, a few months ago, you were the one who suddenly grew stubbornly fixated on doing one particular thing without even discussing it with the family first, deciding entirely on your own, and even resorting to lies. Hearing this, Elena's gaze faltered for a moment, unbidden. You said you married Duke Caden in Miel's place because you loved him. Wasn't what you said, in fact, nothing but a lie? Elena, we were born of the same mother, and grew up under the same roof since childhood. Do you really think we couldn't tell you were lying? At the time, everyone in the family could see right through it. Of course, looking back on it now, perhaps it wasn't entirely a lie after all. But Father agreed to this marriage precisely because of how firm you'd been about it back then. And when he received the letter about your kidnapping, he was overcome with both regret and self-blame. Thinking of her elderly father worrying about her from so far away, Elena couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. I understand now that where you're living is perfectly safe, but I still hope you'll go see Father in person, just once. Once you've seen him, telling him yourself that you're at ease will mean far more than if I relate it for you. Do you understand what I mean? I hope you'll agree, please. I'm asking you. Unexpectedly, that very night, Caden smiled gently and said she really should go visit home. Since your marriage, you've never once seen your family, so taking this chance to go stay with them for a while wouldn't be a bad idea. I'm also worried your family will resent me for not letting you go. Though even if they do resent me, it's fine. They're not my family anyway. That's true, they're not your family, but for some reason, I still want the people who truly love you to think well of me. And so the very next day, Caden went to find his close friend Sydney, asking him to cast his grand teleportation spell to send his little wife and her retinue back to her parents' home. Elena hadn't originally planned to bring along her 3 personal bodyguards, but the 3 handsome young men insisted on tagging along to broaden their horizons. Elena bragged proudly in front of Edward. See how powerful my husband's friend is, teleporting a whole group this large all at once. Not just anyone could pull that off. In the end, when the time came for the young couple to part, Elena gazed at her husband with reluctance, thinking to herself, so she wouldn't be seeing this gentle, devoted man for several days now. She darted straight toward him, cupped Caden's face in her hands, and planted a quick kiss on it, ignoring the look on her brother's face behind her, one that seemed ready to devour someone whole. She waved goodbye. As for the Duke, who'd just been kissed, he stood there with a hand pressed to his cheek, still lost in bliss, unable to snap out of it for the longest time. The grand teleportation spell sent Elena and everyone else straight to her family's home in the capital, and the moment her elder sister saw her, she pulled her into a tight, emotional embrace. Elena warmly greeted everyone in the household, but the household servants had their eyes fixed with keen interest on the young men trailing behind Elena. Look, that one's supposed to be the great archmage. Isn't he handsome, just like a prince? And those knights look pretty good too. Elena scratched her head in confusion. What was going on here? So these guys actually had quite the appeal after all. At last, Elena got to see her handsome father again. Stepping into the room, a wave of warmth washed over her. Why on earth did you light the fireplace? I heard you were coming home, so it came right back to me. Ever since you were little, you've always loved the fireplace, hated the cold, in that way you take after your mother so much. You're the one who resembles her most, so every time I see you, I often think of her. Perhaps that's also why I've always been so overprotective of you. Father, Elena, do you remember what your sister told you on your wedding day? She said, as long as you wanted to, you could come home any time at all. Yes, I still remember. I want you to know that was said from the heart. You don't need to weigh any conditions. nor worry about your circumstances or surroundings. All you need to do is listen to your own heart. So if you ever want to come back, anytime at all is fine. This family's door will always be open for you. All you need is to understand that. Hearing her father's heartfelt words, Elena was too moved to speak. Yes, father. Back at her parents' home, rarely reunited with her beloved family, Elena drank a little too much that night out of sheer joy. Edward helplessly snatched the cup away from her, worried his foolish little sister might get drunk and cause a scene. Her elder sister suggested with a laugh that she go get some fresh air in the courtyard to sober up. By then, all three bodyguards were somewhat tipsy too, staggering as they insisted on tagging along to protect Elena. She could only look at them, at a loss. You three don't need to. I can go by myself just fine. Under the gentle moonlight, Elena sat in the courtyard catching the breeze for a while, and felt her mind clear up considerably. The girl closed her eyes, savoring the cool air, then suddenly called out, "Edward, how long do you plan to keep hiding?" Edward stepped out from behind her, looking a little put out. "How did you know it was me?" "I just had a feeling it would be." Elena curled up a little, her face flushed pink from the wine. "What do you think?" "Think about what?" "I mean about my husband, tell me honestly. Does he seem like a good person to you? Aren't you supposed to be great at reading people?" All she got in response was her brother rolling his eyes. "Hey now. You're drunk. What am I even supposed to say to you right now?" Edward sighed, his mind suddenly drifting back to the last time he'd gone to see Caden. Back then, he'd quietly sought Caden out and asked why he hadn't simply thrown him out. But Caden's answer had been nothing like what he'd expected. Caden genuinely didn't care what anyone thought of him, including this brother-in-law of his. The reason he hadn't thrown Edward out was that Edward's motives had come entirely from concern for Elena. "The reason I've received you at all is because you're a brother who genuinely worries about my wife." The Duke looked at him with a cold, distant gaze, as if speaking to a total stranger. Even after Edward later learned the Duke truly loved his sister, he still didn't feel entirely at ease about it. "I still don't know whether he's a good man or not, but I do think he could become a good husband for you." Hearing the very first words of approval from her own family regarding her husband, Elena was so happy her eyes crinkled into a wide smile. Elsewhere, Sidney was making his rounds, checking the wards around the estate, lantern in hand, when his sister Lily suddenly called out and stopped him. Sidney froze, confused simply because she'd just called him Cy, and it took him a moment to even register that she meant him. "Well, your name is Sidney Lewin, isn't it? So Cy for short, obviously." Not that he particularly minded, but it was strange that she'd suddenly given him such an odd nickname out of nowhere, and Sidney was still standing there dazed. When, the very next second, he saw Lily about to climb out the window and jump, Sidney bolted over in a panic and grabbed hold of Lily tightly. It turned out that Lily, too, had had a little too much to drink tonight. She'd always adored her little sister since childhood. But then one day, out of nowhere, her sister had come running home to announce she was getting married, without ever telling the family the real reason why. What on earth was she thinking? What was she trying to shoulder on that fragile frame of hers? Her sister felt both heartbroken and utterly powerless. Sidney was equally taken aback, since as far as he knew, this marriage had only ever been meant to seal some kind of business deal. I'm not entirely sure myself, but the Duke's wife, whenever she was at the ducal castle, always seemed genuinely happy. Even though they hadn't known each other long, the two of them got along remarkably well. They relied on one another, almost as if fate itself had arranged it. Sidney had always found the way the two of them had met rather hard to believe. "So she really is happy. That's wonderful then, thank you." Her worried sister finally felt at ease. Then, out of nowhere, she turned the conversation towards Sidney. "You're a really good person, you know? You truly are so kind, not just friendly, but gentle. And handsome, too." The girl trailed off mid-sentence, her head drooping, and fell asleep before she even realized it. The wizard sighed helplessly, wearing a weary expression. He couldn't just leave her out here alone either. So he scooped her up and carried her back to her room himself. Why is he going this way? The next morning, when Elena happened to run into her normally tough-as-nails sister, talking to her own wizard while acting shy as a little girl, she froze in shock for a full 5 seconds. Afterward, she asked Sidney what exactly was going on between the two of them. Sidney had no choice but to recount, rather helplessly, what had happened the night before, how he'd carried Lily, and after asking the servants where her room was, brought her back to bed. "I thought there couldn't possibly be a nickname more shocking than Lord of the Black Tower. Turns out I was wrong." The wizard simply looked at the still slightly dazed girl with a knowing, teasing glint in his eyes. "You and your sister really are alike. I suppose I've learned something new today." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the girl standing there, still not quite over her confusion. Back at her parents' home, Elena also took the chance to visit her cousin. Luckily, what her cousin had once said about taking Elena's place at the ducal castle had only been words spoken in a moment of anger. She'd had a fight with her boyfriend, and in a fit of temper had blurted out wanting to switch back, such an unreasonable request. Elena finally let out a sigh of relief. At the dinner table, her uncle sincerely thanked Elena for having suffered in his own daughter's place. "It should be me thanking you, uncle. Thanks to you, I get to enjoy a happy marriage with the husband I love. I'm truly grateful to you." Her uncle's eyes went wide with astonishment, before he finally let out a breath of relief, finally setting down a worry he'd carried for so long. At first, he'd worried about his niece being married off somewhere so far away. But looking at it now, his niece wasn't just doing well. She was truly happy. On her wedding day back then, the two of them had promised to gift him a mineral mine. Excavating relics had always been his lifelong dream. Recently, he'd just unearthed a relic from the mine. Judging by its shape, it looked like some kind of weapon. Was she interested in taking a look? "No thanks, I won't look." Elena had never had any interest in weapon relics. She declined politely with a smile. After leaving her uncle's house, Elena invited Sydney and her 3 bodyguards out for a stroll around town, planning to stop by their favorite egg tart shop to buy some pastries. Unexpectedly, right then, a temple carriage happened to be blocking the road ahead. Its wheel had come loose and was only half repaired. But with too few hands to help, the repair was taking forever. Elena was about to call her 3 bodyguards over to lend a hand, when Sydney, beside her, spoke up coldly. "All we need to do is move that carriage out of the way. Why bother with the rest?" With that, without waiting for Elena's reaction, and before everyone's astonished eyes, he simply used magic to hoist the carriage ahead of them straight into the air. "What do you think you're doing?" one of the temple's people shrieked in terror. "Isn't it because you people looked down on the lowborn as filthy and refused to ride alongside them that you ended up in this mess in the first place? To keep this from happening again, you should have chosen to share a carriage with your servants from the very start. I do hope you'll learn something from this." After the carriage passed, Elena stared intently at Sydney. "Do you know that person?" "I know him, but we're not close." Elena headed home with a mind full of questions. That night, she found Sydney standing alone by the window, seemingly lost in thought. "Lord of the Black Tower, what are you doing over there?" "I'm just thinking about a few things." "Thinking about what?" "I'm thinking about Kaiden." Hearing that answer, the girl instantly grew wary. At that, Sydney turned to face her, his expression serious. "Do you know how Kaiden and I first met?" On the surface, the temple had always been seen as a sacred place, revered by everyone. But behind closed doors, it did nothing but immoral deeds. Sydney had originally been an orphan, wandering the streets since childhood, until, on the verge of starving to death, he'd happened to encounter a temple priest who took him in. But the days that followed were nowhere near as pleasant as he'd imagined. The temple had exploited Sydney's saintly appearance, molding him into a beautiful con artist. A grieving, desperate mother would pray before the temple, hoping for her son to be healed. Even knowing full well the child was beyond saving, Sydney would still have to tell her, against his own conscience, that the temple could grant the child peace. Afterward, the mother would donate a large sum of money to the temple. Sydney had no wish to keep pulling off scams like this. But every time he pushed back, the priest would lock him away in a dungeon, imprisoned for 3 days straight. From then on, the moment he so much as complained he couldn't do it, they'd lock him up again. Once locked up, it would last for days on end, without even a sip of water to drink. Until 2 years later, he met Kaiden. By that point, the temple's standing had already declined significantly from what it once was. No more droughts or floods, no more need to make offerings to the gods. Among the nobility, some had begun to doubt the temple's purpose, and to shore up their standing, the priests hatched yet another wicked scheme. They turned their sights on the Duke, seeking to exploit the marks on his face as proof that the demon's curse was real, then held a grand exorcism ceremony to prove the temple still served a great purpose. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find a shred of evidence linking the marks to any demon. At this point, the priests came up with an even more vicious scheme. If there was no evidence, they'd simply fabricate one. "Hold on!" Elena snapped irritably, demanding he stop, then turned and ran off to fetch a pot of tea. If she didn't down some tea to cool her temper, she was afraid she wouldn't be able to stop herself from marching straight to the temple to settle the score. Watching his best friend's wife defend him so fiercely, Sydney couldn't help but break into a warm smile. Back then, the task the temple had assigned him was to stay by Duke Kaiden's side and do everything possible to find something suspicious about him. If he truly couldn't find anything, he was to make Kaiden injure himself in front of everyone, and once he'd been publicly wounded before the whole populace, the temple would then treat the wound themselves, disguising it to look as though it had been inflicted by demonic power. But the very moment he met Caden, a thought suddenly flooded his mind, making him forget his original mission entirely, if only for a moment. At the time, he'd thought if only that cursed mark had grown on his own skin instead. "What's wrong? I'm hardly any luckier than you, wearing this white priest's robe of mine, forced to swindle people out of their money for the temple, day in and day out. If I don't, the temple locks me in a dungeon, starves me for days and nights on end. You're different from me. You're not an orphan, so you couldn't possibly understand what that feels like. People take interest in the marks on your body, really, only because of your bloodline and your status. As for me, an orphan of unknown origin, even if flowers bloomed across my own face, no one would spare it a second glance. If that mark had grown on me instead, I probably never would have become a priest like I am now, and you wouldn't have had to stay by my side investigating evidence of the curse either." Saying this, Caden suddenly stopped walking and turned to ask in return, "You know how to use magic, don't you? You've always kept it hidden, but you actually do know how to cast spells, don't you? So why haven't you left the temple? What did you say? I asked you why you haven't quit the priesthood." The man's question struck straight at the young man's core. Sydney furrowed his brow and gave the reason. "In the head priest's chamber, deep within the temple, there's a registry. Only once my name is struck from it can I take off this priest's robe, but I'm forbidden from ever setting foot in there. So why not just risk it and force your way in?" The silver-haired young man simply stayed silent, offering no reply. A flicker crossed Caden's still youthful face, a touch of sorrow, so you can't bring yourself to do it. "I understand. After all, I was once the same way, but somewhere along the line, whether my family lived or died stopped mattering to me at all. By the time they actually died, I felt nothing, and yet even so, I still couldn't bring myself to kill them with my own hands." He then shifted his tone, asking Sydney what he'd want to do if he could leave the temple. Sydney blurted out that he'd want to do something related to magic, then caught himself halfway through and quickly denied it, insisting he'd never once thought about it. Caden simply looked at him quietly for a moment, then let a faint, knowing smile cross his face. The very next day, he tossed a thick book straight at Sydney. Opening it, he found it was, of all things, the registry with his own name written inside. Sydney was stunned. Caden had actually gotten his hands on that registry, and it had taken him only a single day to do it. Burn the whole registry or just erase your name, the choice is yours to make. Word had it that half the temple was destroyed that very night. The girl listened, utterly stunned. She'd never imagined her husband had been this fearsomely bold in his younger years. It was only later that I learned it had taken him just 1 hour, start to finish. And he'd done it entirely alone, taking down every last guard, even breaking through the head priest's own wards. The temple never pursued the matter at all, after all. Letting people know the temple had been single-handedly torn apart by Caden wasn't exactly good publicity, especially since it was the temple that had provoked Caden in the first place. Unless they could silence him completely, there was no avoiding having to offer some kind of explanation. After that incident, Sydney had once wanted to repay the Duke, but Caden had simply told him, "You don't need to do anything at all. Just do whatever it is you actually want to do." Once I gained my freedom, the Lord of the Black Tower at the time took me on as his student. And a year later, I became the new Lord of the Black Tower myself. I often wonder if Caden hadn't stood up for me that day, what would have become of me? Perhaps I'd still be trapped under the temple's cruelty, until I was pushed to the brink of madness and ended up killing a few people by accident, living out my life on the run. Having heard Sydney's entire story, Elena quietly made up her own mind about something. So early the next morning, she brought along a ledger she'd worked on all night and marched straight to the temple to collect a debt. "Go on. Hand over every single coin ever donated to the temple in my name up until now. All of it. Back to me." Sydney found her behavior both amusing and exasperating. "You came to the temple just to demand money back?" "That's right. And honestly, I'm not even sure why I feel the need to do this. What's there not to understand? If I don't get this anger out of my system, I'm afraid I might actually faint from the sheer fury of it." The priest who came to receive them turned out to be the very same one whose carriage had broken down the day before. Elena showed him not the slightest courtesy, and flatly demanded he return every last coin she'd donated over the years, without a single cent missing. The priest gave a polite, plainly fake smile. "Might I ask the reason? And while I'm at it, allow me to remind my lady, the temple does not accept baseless personal refund requests, especially not in cases where the lady has simply lost faith in the temple after listening to someone else's slander." The priest cast a meaningful glance toward Sydney. then let slip an even more shocking remark, directly accusing the Duke, declaring outright that the marks on his face were nothing less than a demon's curse. Sydney was itching to argue back, but Elena, remarkably calm, held him back, letting the priest finish what he had to say. The priest, assuming his words had rattled Elena, only grew more smug, insisting the marks on the Duke's face were nearly identical to the ancient demon's own markings. I heard it was only similar, not an exact match. The mere similarity of the pattern is already problematic enough on its own. Whatever minor differences exist hardly matter. The priest sneered slyly. But he was instantly caught off guard by the girl's counter. I already knew you'd say exactly that. With that, she pulled out a weathered ancient book. Do you see the pattern here? This is precisely the pattern used in the ancient rites of demon sacrifice, and the very entrance to your own temple, wouldn't you know it, bears the exact same carving. The priest, whose name was Minaing, couldn't sit still the moment he saw the drawing, stammering out a panicked rebuttal that while the two were quite similar, a closer look still revealed real differences. The mere similarity of the pattern is already problematic enough on its own. Whatever minor differences exist hardly matter. Wouldn't you agree, Priest Baika? In the end, thanks to the girl's clever scheme, the two of them successfully reclaimed every last coin of the donations. Stepping out of the temple, Elena's eyes crinkled with a wide, satisfied smile. Just picturing the temple's pained expression, as if their very hearts were being torn out piece by piece while handing back the money, left her feeling so gloriously refreshed she could have eaten 2 extra bowls of rice. Only Sydney had caught the real crux of the matter, that pattern used for demon sacrifice. He wondered just where on earth Elena had learned about it. The girl, despite looking utterly drained with exhaustion, answered him with surprising energy. To find a matching pattern, she'd spent the entire night before flipping through over 100 books. It had genuinely taken quite a bit of time. So what do you plan on doing with all this money? Elena hadn't quite decided yet, joking that maybe she'd just hand it all over to him. But Sydney refused. The very sight of money swindled from the temple made his skin crawl with discomfort. Just then, they happened to walk past their adorable bodyguards. Elena tossed the heavy pouch of gold coins straight to Thomas, already having a brilliant idea in mind. Using this money to outfit the knights of the ducal castle with new armor, or buy them extra training supplies, that sounded like a pretty solid plan, too. As they were leaving the temple, a white-haired head priest came rushing after them. Elena assumed the temple had changed its mind and wanted to send someone to reclaim the gold, and quickly told everyone to hurry ahead. Elsewhere, Priest Baika, furious, cursed his rotten luck while ordering someone to burn every last donation ledger. The head priest, having just caught up with them, hurriedly asked who that person who'd just left was. What's wrong with you? I felt holy power. That surge of energy matched perfectly with what's recorded in the ancient texts. I'm certain of it. That was holy power. The head priest suddenly grew wildly excited. It's been nearly 300 years since anyone with holy power has appeared again. We must find that person no matter what it takes. Whether it's a holy maiden or a holy son, we must exalt them above all else. Reverend head priest, I don't understand what you're talking about. You must be mistaken. What, you're saying I'm mistaken? Yes, you're most certainly mistaken. What do you mean by that? You just asked who the person who left the temple a moment ago was, didn't you? That was Duke Caden's wife. What? The head priest looked utterly disbelieving, though a flicker of hope still lingered in his heart, only for Baika to immediately snuff out that lovely dream of his. Do you know what that lady came to the temple for today? She asked me whether I felt even the slightest remorse over what happened 7 years ago, so she will absolutely never cooperate with our temple. And if she really does possess holy power, she might just end up founding an entirely new sect of her own instead. What's more, she came here with Sydney, so please stop wasting your energy thinking about it. Holy power may have served a great purpose in the old days, but times have changed. Illness can now be treated through medicine, and this land no longer has any evil to be purged. So even if holy power were to be revived, it wouldn't serve any real purpose anymore. It could never help the temple reclaim its former glory. Elsewhere, ever since the last time Rebecca had used her mysterious power to control her father, from using it too many times, the old man had truly become a mindless fool. Rebecca merely felt a headache coming on. She'd originally meant to spin her foolish brother's mess into an image of a sympathetic victim, but never expected the Duke wouldn't believe a word of it, not only cutting off their funding, but buying up every last debt the family owed. Once the creditors came knocking, the family would crumble step by step. She turned and walked away. Stepping into a pitch-black basement, she summoned a man named Mikkel. The man's eyes were hollow and vacant, exactly like the old barons had looked while under her control earlier. She ordered him to head to the capital, to keep close watch over the Duke's wife's every move and report back to her at any time. Afterward, she stepped into another pitch-black room. On the floor of the room lay a massive, mysterious magic circle, and resting atop it was a sheepskin scroll, recording how the circle was meant to be used. It turned out this circle was called a cross-dimensional summoning circle. If a living creature were summoned, the situation would become extremely dangerous, requiring the recorded cancellation spell to send it back immediately. But if a dead thing were summoned instead, the blood from its corpse could be put to use, followed by details on the blood's effects and how to use it. Having finished reading the circle's instructions, Rebecca was overjoyed. She distributed the blood she'd obtained among her subordinates to test, and discovered that the blood could grant people power. And with this miraculous substance, she quickly built up her own network of influence. But before long, her own younger brother uncovered the secret. Yet she didn't panic in the slightest. Instead, she took her little brother's own blood and dripped it onto the circle, and discovered that the blood of a summoned corpse could make a female creature conceive without ever mating at all. But she never expected her brother to be so utterly useless, getting caught by the Duke's own wife, and in the end getting killed by the Duke himself, which only deepened the Duke's suspicion of them. Rebecca made up her mind. She would kidnap the Duke's wife first, then use her to eliminate the Duke. She picked up the eerie, blood-soaked necklace resting on her chest, a sly smile crossing her face, a pair of monsters dying together for love that had a certain charm to it too. Elsewhere, Elena had just returned home after collecting her debt from the temple, and shared the good news with her family, never expecting that not only would they not scold her for it, they'd throw both hands up in full support. Elena's heart warmed at that. Father, I love you. Sister, I love you. Brother Edward, I suppose I love you too. Her sister's oddly questioning declaration of affection made Edward's blood boil instantly on the spot. Early the next morning, a piercing scream rang out through the entire castle. It turned out Elena had finally realized that her own wedding, all those years ago, had been held at none other than the temple itself. Just thinking about how utterly displeased her husband must have been at the time, she decided this had officially been the worst wedding in history. A sudden idea sparked in the girl's mind. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they could just redo it from scratch? That's it exactly. What's the harm in holding it all over again? I want to plan my own wedding myself this time. Who would dare have an objection? Just as she was excitedly planning out the new wedding, her sister suddenly appeared and cut her off, inviting her out for a shopping trip around town instead. It's been ages since we two sisters went out shopping together, and since you're rarely home, come let loose with me for a bit. But the moment they stepped outside, her sister exchanged a knowing glance with Edward, who was already waiting outside. The plan was for the Duke to show up unannounced at the wedding dress shop, taking his little wife completely by surprise. But before the Duke could even arrive, right as Elena was trying on her 99th dress, a masked man suddenly stepped out from the fitting room. The man ignored the maids shouting at him from all sides, walking straight up to Elena. Elena looked at him, utterly bewildered. The man's expression stayed perfectly calm. "My lady, greetings can wait. Please come with me now." Then, before anyone could even react, the ruby necklace on his chest suddenly flared with an eerie red light. The man's face instantly turned sinister and terrifying. "Don't make a sound. Just come with me quietly." At this very moment, Elena realized in horror that everyone around her had frozen in place, as though time itself had stopped. At the same time, a thick, foul stench began radiating from his body. The man froze for a split second at Elena's reaction, and taking advantage of his momentary daze, Elena instantly remembered the magical tools on her person, and immediately cast a spell, Gale Force. The loud noise caught the attention of her guards stationed outside the door. The 3 bodyguards instantly broke the door down and rushed in. "My lady, are you all right?" Only once they saw Elena safe and unharmed did they finally breathe a sigh of relief. It was only then that everyone noticed the man lying on the ground. His wig and mask had been blown clean off by the gale, revealing long brown hair and a soft, feminine face. Elena looked at the woman lying on the ground and found her strangely familiar. She was just about to step closer to confirm it, when the woman suddenly whipped her head around, glaring at her, and screamed, "This can't be." At the same time, she activated the necklace at her chest once more, unleashing her strange power yet again. When Elena opened her eyes again, she found everyone around her frozen once more. What terrified her even more was that her own sister, as if under someone's control, was walking step by step toward Rebecca. Elena screamed with all her might for her sister to stop, but her sister moved like nothing more than a puppet, walking right up to Rebecca, becoming a hostage in her hands. By now, Rebecca had put her mask back on, holding a dagger against Elena's sister's throat, though her face still carried a look of disbelief. How is this possible? Why isn't it working? Just who are you? Elena glared furiously at her. What exactly do you want from me? Rebecca found this utterly unbelievable. She'd clearly controlled everyone else just moments ago. So why was the necklace's power useless against Elena? Could it be that the Duke wasn't the only one immune after all? After a long moment of thought, Rebecca's face darkened, and she demanded Elena strip off every magical tool on her body immediately. Elena had no choice but to comply, but the moment she'd tossed the tools aside, a hand suddenly shot out from beside her, clamping down on her throat and hoisting her up into the air. Opening her eyes, she realized in horror that the one strangling her was none other than her own controlled bodyguard, Max. Max's eyes trembled faintly. It turned out he too was fighting with everything he had against the control. Taking advantage of the brief moment his grip loosened, Elena whispered softly, Max, obey my command. Right now. Let go. The very next second, Elena shut her eyes and slid down along the wall. Rebecca, assuming Elena was already dead, moved in to finish her off for good measure. Elena suddenly caught the blade with her bare hand. Ignoring the sharp pain as the edge cut into her palm, she wrenched it free and flung it aside, then immediately drove a punch straight into Rebecca's face. Realizing Elena was about to make a run for it, Rebecca screamed, Grab that girl, Mikhail! Mikhail appeared out of nowhere, lunging forward, only to be intercepted just in time by Thomas, who had just come to. My lady, are you all right? He quickly drew his sword and clashed with Mikhail. But Mikhail was simply too strong, and within just a few moves, Thomas was sent flying off to the side. Elena cried out his name in anguished worry. She'd originally meant to handle this quietly, but there's no need for that now. Kill them all, spare only the Duke's wife. Everyone else dies. Rebecca, having lost all patience, snapped out the order to Mikhail in fury. Mikhail, like some heartless machine, began a slaughter throughout the shop. Everyone finally snapped back to their senses at this point. Two bodyguards immediately moved to shield Elena. Her sister pulled her into a tight embrace. Elena, are you all right? But Mikhail was far too powerful, and all three bodyguards proved no match for him. Watching them fall one after another, Elena reached for the magical tools on her body, only to realize in horror that no matter where she looked, Mikhail was nowhere to be seen, never suspecting he was already standing right behind her. Just as he was about to strike, he suddenly froze, glancing down. Colin had thrown his arms tightly around Mikhail's right leg, refusing to let him take another step forward. No, you can't hurt my lady. But how could a heartless man like that ever regard something so small as an ant? He simply swung his blade coldly, and a long streak of blood spread across the ground. Colin, Elena screamed in anguish. Mikhail suddenly flinched, dodging a massive surge of sword energy that had just come crashing down from the rooftop. Elena could barely believe her own eyes as she looked at the man who'd just appeared. It was none other than the very Duke all of us had been waiting so many episodes to see. Her brother Edward looked anxiously at his two sisters. And the wizard, normally so composed, couldn't hide his own shock either. The Duke said nothing more, charging forward, sword raised, to face off against the assassin Mikhail. The man who'd just been running rampant everywhere else couldn't withstand a single blow before the Duke. In just 2 or 3 strikes, the sword in his hand was sent flying. Mikhail stared at his now empty hand, seemingly unable to comprehend how he'd failed. The Duke gave him no chance to recover, swinging his sword forward to finish him off, and it was only then that Mikhail snapped back to his senses. He shot a quick glance toward Elena, then pulled a dagger from within his clothes, and hurled it at her with every last bit of strength he had. A sharp clang of metal rang out. The Duke had already teleported directly in front of his little wife, knocking the dagger clean away. Mikhail, seizing the opportunity, grabbed hold of Rebecca and leapt out through the window to flee. We can't let him get away, Sydney shouted, unleashing a burst of blue light. But sadly, they were still one step too slow. Mikhail had already led everyone away without a trace. By now, Elena felt utterly drained. Sinking down onto the ground, Caden hurried to support her, his voice thick with worry. Are you all right? Elena's face still looked dazed. How did you even get here? Caden scooped her up into his arms. Let's get you home and treat your wounds first. I'll explain the rest later. Elena's mind, having just survived such an ordeal, was still hazy with confusion. All she could see was her own right hand, bleeding without pause. That's right. And her husband's face, filled with worry, gazing down at her. I'm hurt. And that woman, why did she seem so familiar? Who on earth was she? Before she could finish the thought, the girl slowly closed her eyes sinking into a pitch-black darkness.